Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. They tell you the desert doesn't lie. That's what they said during training at Quantico, back when I still believed in clean answers and procedure manuals. After 17 years working the southern border for DEA, I can tell you the desert doesn't lie. It just doesn't tell you everything. This incident occurred in November 2019, approximately 40 miles west of the town of Douglas, in the state of Arizona. It was the kind of area where the fence had been reduced to scattered posts, and the actual border was just an idea lost in creosote and sand. I was leading a routine interdiction operation, tracking a group that intelligence suggested was a medium-sized group transporting goods north from the San Bernardino Valley corridor. For 3 nights in a row, always between 2 and 4 a.m., we made thermal detections on the same route for the same number of people. 7 individuals. Always 7. My name is Marcus Reyes, and I've been with DEA's Border Task Force since 2002. Started in Texas, moved to New Mexico, finally settled into Arizona where the real work happens. The work nobody talks about at press conferences. I've seen things out here that make the official reports look like children's books, but I've always been able to file them away, compartmentalize, move on to the next operation. This one was different. The operation brief had been standard. Agent Foster from Sector Command had pulled me aside 3 days earlier in the Douglas field office, a cramped building that smelled like burnt coffee and old reports. He'd spread a map across the desk, his finger tracing the corridor we'd been monitoring. Same thermal signature, same route, same timing, Foster had said. His voice carried that flat quality of someone who'd been doing this too long. 7 warm bodies, moving at a consistent pace. They're disciplined, Reyes. Too disciplined for the usual coyote operations. I'd studied the map. The route made tactical sense. It avoided the main sensor arrays, used natural terrain for cover, and ended at a pickup point near Highway 80, where a vehicle could blend into early morning traffic. Professional work. What's the product estimate? I'd asked. That's the thing. Foster had leaned back in his chair, making it creak. Based on their pace and the terrain, we're estimating they're carrying heavy, maybe 60-70 pounds each. That's close to $500,000 street value if it's pure. I'd let out a low whistle. That kind of product meant serious players, the kind who don't leave witnesses. I want you on Overwatch, Foster had continued. Take the night vision rig, position yourself on the ridge above their route. We'll have ground units ready to move in once you confirm the count and cargo. Clean interdiction. By the book. By the book. That phrase would come back to haunt me. The night of the operation, I'd driven out alone in an unmarked pickup, taking the service roads that snaked through the desert hills. The temperature had already dropped to the low 40s, typical for November in the high desert. I'd parked the truck 2 miles from my observation point and hiked the rest of the way, carrying 50 pounds of surveillance gear on my back. The ridge provided me with a good view of the valley below. I could see the gap between 2 rocky outcrops, naturally shaped like a funnel, which forced the terrain to the north. This gap directed movements along a predictable path. I set up my night vision goggles, thermal imaging camera, and laser rangefinder, transforming my position into a one-man observation post. The first 2 hours had been quiet. Just wind moving through the scrub and the occasional sound of something small scurrying through the rocks. I'd used the time to scan the valley systematically, noting landmarks, measuring distances, planning sight lines for when the targets appeared. At 0147 hours, I got my first thermal hit. 7 figures emerged from the southern darkness, moving in a tight single-file line. Even through the thermal scope, I could see they were carrying heavy loads, the heat signatures showing the strain on their bodies. They moved with purpose but also with caution, stopping every few minutes to scan their surroundings. I'd keyed my radio, keeping my voice low. Overwatch to control. I have visual confirmation. 7 individuals, heavily loaded, proceeding north through the corridor. Distance approximately 2,000 meters. Foster's voice had crackled back. Copy that, Overwatch. Ground units are staging. Maintain observation and update on their position. Standard procedure. I'd settled in to watch them cross. That's when I noticed the first irregularity. Through the night vision scope, I was counting them as they moved through a clear section of the valley. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But when I switched to thermal imaging to confirm, I counted again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 heat signatures. I'd blinked, adjusted the scope, counted again. Through night vision, 7 figures. Through thermal, 8 distinct heat sources. Control, Overwatch, I'd radioed. I'm getting an inconsistent count between visual and thermal. Can you confirm the intel number? A pause. Then, Foster's voice, slightly puzzled. Intel confirmed 7 individuals on the previous 3 nights. What are you seeing? Night vision shows 7 clear figures. Thermal is showing 8 heat signatures. I'd zoomed in, trying to resolve the discrepancy. The 8th signature is moving with them. Same pace, same formation, but I can't see it through NVGs. Another pause, longer this time. Equipment malfunction? I'd check the thermal camera. All readings were normal. Battery full. No error indicators. Negative. Equipment is functioning normally. Keep tracking them, Foster had ordered. Ground units will sort it out on interdiction. I'd continued watching, but now with a knot forming in my stomach. The 8 thermal signatures moved together like a coordinated unit, but through night vision I could only ever see 7 actual people. The 8th heat source seemed to move between them, sometimes at the front of the line, sometimes at the rear, sometimes right in the middle of the formation. As they moved closer to the interdiction point, I'd tried different angles, different zoom levels, switching back and forth between visual and thermal. The results never changed. 7 visible people, 8 heat signatures. At 0223 hours, they reached the designated interdiction point, a flat area at the base of the ridge where our ground units had the best approach vectors. I'd radioed the final position update, watching as our 4-vehicle team moved in with lights and sirens. The crossers had scattered immediately, dropping their loads and running in different directions. Standard response. But I'd kept my scopes on them, counting as our agents ran them down. 1 suspect apprehended, 2 suspects apprehended, 3 suspects apprehended, 4, 5, 6. Then silence. I'd keyed my radio. Control Overwatch. I count 6 apprehensions. Confirm you have all suspects. Foster's voice came back after a moment. Ground units report 6 in custody. We're doing a sweep for a 7th. Thermal shows. I'd paused, checking my scope again. Thermal shows 7 heat signatures in the area. 6 are with our agents. The 7th is moving north, fast. I'd tracked it through the scope. The heat signature was running, but not like someone fleeing. It was moving in a straight line, not avoiding obstacles, not seeking cover. Just moving north at a steady pace that was somehow too fast for a person on foot through that terrain. Ground units. You have a runner heading north-northwest from the interdiction point, I'd reported, approximately 100 meters beyond your perimeter. 2 of our units had broken off to pursue, their vehicles bouncing across the rough terrain. I'd watched through the thermal scope as they closed in on the fleeing signature. And then it was gone, not fading into the distance, not hiding behind cover, just gone. 1 second, the thermal signature was there, clear and distinct. The next second, nothing but the cold desert floor. "Control, Overwatch," I'd radioed, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've lost thermal contact with the 7th signature. Last known position approximately 200 meters north of the interdiction point. Ground units see anything?" Foster had asked. The responses came back negative. 2 teams had converged on the last known position and found nothing. No tracks, no heat signature, no disturbance in the sand. "Overwatch, what about the 8th signature you reported earlier?" Foster's voice carried a new edge. I'd scanned the entire valley with thermal. Our 6 suspects showed up clearly, along with our agents. The vehicles were bright white spots in the scope, but there was no 8th signature, no 7th signature either, after it had vanished. "Negative contact on either unknown signature," I'd reported. The sweep had continued for another hour. They'd found the dropped bundles, exactly 6 of them, each containing roughly 70 pounds of methamphetamine. Street value, $400,000. A good bust by any measure, but the numbers bothered me. 6 suspects, 6 bundles, but I'd counted 7 figures through night vision, 8 through thermal. When I'd finally packed up my gear and hiked back to my truck, dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. The desert looked normal in the growing light. Rocks, sand, scrub brush, nothing unusual. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there with those smugglers. Something that showed up on thermal imaging, but not through night vision. Something that could vanish between 1 second and the next. I'd driven back to the Douglas field office where Foster was waiting with coffee and paperwork. The 6 suspects were already processed and waiting for transport to Tucson. The drugs were cataloged and secured. A clean operation, by the numbers. "Hell of a night," Foster had said, sliding a mug across to me. "Good work on the Overwatch." I'd wrapped my hands around the mug, feeling the warmth. About those count discrepancies. Equipment glitch. Foster had cut me off. Thermal sensors can get false readings. Desert heat, reflected IR signature from rocks, atmospheric conditions. Happens all the time. But it hadn't felt like a glitch. It had felt like something else, something wrong. And the signature that vanished? Foster had shrugged. Could have been anything. Desert fox, javelina, hell, even a coyote shows up on thermal. You track what you think is a person, turns out to be wildlife. The mind plays tricks at dark 30. I'd wanted to argue, to explain that I'd been doing this job long enough to know the difference between a person and an animal on thermal imaging. But Foster's expression had made it clear the conversation was over. We had 6 suspects, 6 bundles, a successful interdiction. The rest was just noise in the system. But that night, lying in my bed in the small apartment I kept in Douglas, I couldn't stop thinking about that 8th heat signature. The one that had moved with them, invisible to night vision but clear as day on thermal. The 7th figure that had run north and vanished like smoke. I'd pulled out my personal laptop and started searching through DEA reports from the sector, looking for similar anomalies. Inconsistent counts, unexplained thermal readings, anything that matched what I'd experienced. What I found kept me awake until morning. Over the past 2 years, there had been 7 other reports from agents working the Douglas sector mentioning count discrepancies during operations. In each case, the official explanation had been equipment malfunction or environmental interference. But reading between the lines, I could see the same confusion I'd felt. Agents counting one number visually, getting a different number on thermal. Signatures appearing and disappearing without explanation. One report, filed 6 months earlier by an agent named Briggs, had particularly caught my attention. He'd been running solo overwatch on a similar operation and had reported counting 8 individuals through his scope, but finding only 7 sets of tracks when the ground team swept the area. His report had included a note that the 8th set of thermal readings had been inconsistent with normal human signature patterns. What did that mean, I'd wondered. How could a thermal signature be inconsistent with a human pattern? I'd fallen asleep finally as dawn broke again, but my dreams had been filled with thermal images of figures moving through the desert, their numbers changing every time I counted them. The days after that operation blurred together in the way they do when you're working the border. Briefings, surveillance shifts, paperwork, more briefings. But I couldn't stop thinking about the phantom count. Couldn't stop seeing that 8th thermal signature in my mind. 3 weeks later, Foster called me into his office again. Same desk, same maps, same burnt coffee smell. But his expression was different this time. Tighter. "We've got movement on the same corridor," he'd said without preamble. "Same timeline, same pattern. Intel suggests another shipment coming through tomorrow night." I'd felt something cold settle in my stomach. Same group? Different players, according to the chatter we've intercepted. But same route, same discipline. They're testing us, Reyes. Seeing if we've got that corridor locked down, or if the last interdiction was just luck. What's the plan? Foster had pulled out a fresh map. This one marked with new positions. "We're doubling the ground units, 8 agents, 4 vehicles, complete perimeter coverage. And I want you on Overwatch again. Same position, same equipment." "Same equipment?" I'd asked carefully. He'd looked up at me, and something in his eyes suggested he understood the real question. We had the thermal camera serviced after the last operation. Full diagnostic, complete calibration check. It's functioning perfectly. So, they had been concerned about the readings. Concerned enough to service equipment that had shown no error codes. What did the diagnostic show? I'd pressed. Clean bill of health. Foster had leaned back. "Look, Reyes, I know the count thing bothered you. It bothered me too. But sometimes in this job we get data that doesn't make perfect sense. Environmental factors, equipment tolerances, human error. We can't let it distract us from the mission." He'd been right, technically. But technically right didn't explain what I'd seen. The next night found me back on the same ridge, same position, same view of the valley corridor. The temperature had dropped even further. Mid-30s with a wind that cut through my jacket. I'd set up the surveillance gear exactly as before, double-checking every connection, every setting, every calibration. At 0203 hours, they came, 9 figures on thermal. I'd counted them twice, then a third time. 9 distinct heat signatures, moving in the same single-file formation, carrying the same heavy loads. Through night vision, I counted 8 people. My hands had been shaking as I keyed the radio. "Control, Overwatch, I have contact. Thermal shows 9 individuals, night vision shows 8. Distance 2,000 meters and closing." A long pause, then Foster's voice, very carefully neutral. "Copy that, Overwatch. Continue observation." No mention of equipment malfunction this time. No dismissal. Just acknowledgement. I'd watched them move through the valley, and this time I'd paid close attention to the extra thermal signature. It moved with the group, but not quite with them. Sometimes it was at the front, several meters ahead. Sometimes it fell back, trailing behind. And sometimes, this was the part that made my skin crawl, it was in the middle of the line, and when that happened, The people ahead and behind it would increase their spacing, like they were unconsciously avoiding something. Control, the extra signature is exhibiting irregular movement patterns, I'd reported. It's not maintaining consistent position within the formation. Can you get a visual confirmation of any kind? I'd tried everything. Maximum zoom on night vision, switching between visible and infrared, even pulling out my personal binoculars to look at them with natural night vision. Every method showed 8 people. Only thermal showed 9. As they approached the interdiction point, I'd noticed something else. The extra thermal signature was giving off a different heat pattern than the others. The 8 visible people showed the normal variations you'd expect. Hotter cores, cooler extremities, heat concentrating in areas of exertion. But the 9th signature was more uniform, like a single temperature throughout, and it was cooler than the others. Not cold, but consistently about 10 degrees lower than human body temperature. Control, the 9th signature is showing approximately 92 degrees Fahrenheit, I'd reported. All other signatures are reading normal human range. Copy that, Foster had acknowledged, but I could hear tension in his voice now. The interdiction had gone smoothly from a tactical standpoint. Our 8 agents had moved in with precision, lights and sirens cutting through the darkness. The smugglers had scattered, but this time there was nowhere to run. We'd positioned the perimeter perfectly. 8 suspects apprehended. 8 bundles of methamphetamine recovered. Through my thermal scope, I'd watched the 9th signature. It hadn't scattered with the others. Instead, it had simply stopped moving when the lights came on, standing completely still in the middle of the interdiction zone while chaos erupted around it. Control, the 9th thermal signature is stationary at the center of the interdiction point, I'd reported. Not fleeing, not taking cover, just standing there. Ground units, do you have visual on a 9th individual? Foster had asked over the radio. The responses came back negative. 8 suspects in custody, area secure, no additional contacts. But on my thermal scope, that 9th signature was still there. Still standing, motionless. And as I watched, it began to move. Not away from the agents, toward them. Control, the signature is moving toward the ground units, I'd said, unable to keep the tension out of my voice now. Heading directly for Vehicle 3. I'd watched as it approached one of our SUVs. Agent Dalton was standing next to the vehicle, checking one of the suspects. The thermal signature moved to within a few feet of him and stopped. Dalton had suddenly looked up, turning his head as if he'd heard something. Through my night vision, I could see his expression change, see him take a step back from the vehicle. Control, this is Ground Unit 3. Dalton's voice had come over the radio, and there was something off about it. I need to report. I'm getting a cold spot here. Temperature just dropped significantly in my immediate area. Define significantly, Foster had responded. I'd estimate 20, maybe 30 degrees in the past few seconds. My breath is visible. Is anyone else experiencing this? The other ground units had reported normal temperatures. Only Dalton was feeling the cold. And on my thermal scope, I could see why. The 9th signature was right next to him, close enough to touch. Unit 3, move away from your current position, Foster had ordered. Dalton had complied, walking about 20 feet away. On thermal, I'd watched the signature follow him. Control, the signature is moving with Agent Dalton, I'd reported. It's maintaining a distance of approximately 2 meters. Unit 3, do you see anything unusual? Foster had asked. Negative visual contact, Dalton had replied. But the cold is moving with me. It's like standing in a freezer door. I'd watched through the scope as Dalton had started walking faster, then jogging. The thermal signature had kept pace with him, never getting closer, never falling behind, just maintaining that 2-meter distance. Finally, Dalton had run to one of the other vehicles and gotten inside, shutting the door. The thermal signature had stopped at the vehicle and stayed there for a moment. Then it had started moving north. "Control, the signature is moving north, same direction as the previous operation," I'd reported. "Speed consistent with a fast walk. All units, do we have anyone pursuing?" No one was pursuing. Everyone was focused on securing the suspects and the drugs. And the thermal signature just kept moving north, steady and unhurried. I'd tracked it for almost a mile before it finally faded from my scope. Not vanishing suddenly like before. Just gradually decreasing in temperature until it matched the background and I couldn't distinguish it anymore. The debriefing back at the field office had been tense. 8 suspects, 8 bundles, another successful interdiction. But Foster had asked me to stay after the others left. "Tell me everything you observed," he'd said, pulling out a notebook. "Every detail." I'd gone through it all. The count discrepancy, the thermal readings, the movement patterns, the cold spot around Dalton. Foster had taken notes without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I'd finished, he'd closed the notebook and looked at me for a long moment. "This is the 3rd operation in 6 months where we've had unexplained thermal readings in this sector," he'd said finally. "The first 2 were written off as equipment issues or environmental factors, but after tonight, with multiple agents confirming unusual phenomena," he'd trailed off, seeming to wrestle with something. "What are you thinking?" I'd prompted. "I'm thinking that we need to bring this up the chain, quietly. Because if I put in an official report saying we're seeing ghosts on thermal imaging, my career is over. But if something is actually out there, if there's some kind of phenomenon we don't understand affecting our operations, we need to know about it." "You believe me," I'd said. It wasn't a question. "I believe our equipment is functioning correctly. I believe multiple trained observers are reporting consistent anomalies. I believe Agent Dalton experienced something that made him run for a vehicle in the middle of a secure interdiction." Foster had rubbed his eyes. "What I believe it means? I have no damn idea." He'd pulled out another file, this one thicker. "I did some digging after the last operation. There have been reports of unusual activity in this sector going back years. Most of it got filed under equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference. But there's a pattern." He'd opened the file, showing me highlighted sections in various reports. Count discrepancies, unexplained thermal readings, agents reporting sudden temperature drops, suspects claiming they'd seen things in the desert that made them turn back. "This goes back to 2015, I'd said, flipping through the pages. "Further than that if you dig into the archives. But the frequency has been increasing. We're seeing these reports monthly now, sometimes weekly. Always in this sector, always on that same corridor." "What's special about that area?" Foster had pulled out a different map. This one, older, showing the region before the current infrastructure. "There used to be a settlement out there. Little place called Dos Cruces. Got abandoned in the 50s when the wells dried up. Now it's just ruins, if that. The corridor we're monitoring runs right through where the town used to be." I'd studied the map, seeing the dotted lines indicating old roads, the symbols marking the abandoned wells. "You think it's related? I think something is happening out there that we don't have a framework to understand. And I think we need to find out what it is before it becomes a bigger problem." The file had included one more piece of information that made my blood run cold. Over the past 4 years, 6 agents who'd worked operations in that sector had requested transfers or left the DEA entirely. When Foster had contacted them for informal interviews, 4 had refused to discuss their time on the border. 1 had been unreachable. And the last one, Agent Briggs, who'd filed that report about inconsistent thermal patterns, had told Foster he'd be happy to talk, but only in person, and only if Foster came alone. "I'm driving up to Phoenix next week to meet with Briggs," Foster had said. "I want you to come with me." I'd agreed, of course. By that point, I needed answers as much as Foster did. But in the week leading up to that meeting, I'd done my own research. Late nights in the office, searching through old files, digital archives, even microfiche records from the county library. The history of Dos Cruces wasn't extensive, just another failed desert settlement, abandoned when it became unsustainable. But there were odd details in the historical records. A higher-than-average death rate for a town its size. Multiple mentions of people wandering off into the desert and never being found. A newspaper article from 1953 about a doctor who'd served the town for 20 years and left suddenly, telling the reporter only that the desert takes more than it gives in some places. I'd also found something else. In the county coroner's records from the 1940s, there were multiple entries for bodies found in the desert around Dos Cruces. Cause of death in most cases was listed as exposure or dehydration, but several entries included a note that had been repeated almost word for word. Body temperature at discovery significantly below expected range for estimated time of death. Cold bodies in a hot desert. Thermal signatures 10 degrees cooler than human normal. The patterns were there if you knew how to look for them. But patterns of what? On the drive up to Phoenix, Foster and I had compared notes. He'd found additional historical anomalies, including reports from early border patrol operations in the 60s mentioning equipment failures and unusual readings in the Dos Cruces area. Every generation seems to rediscover this and then forget about it, Foster had mused as we crossed into Phoenix city limits. Or maybe every generation decides it's better not to know. Agent Briggs lived in a modest house in a quiet suburban neighborhood about as far from the border as you could get while staying in Arizona. He'd answered the door looking older than his 47 years, with the kind of exhaustion that comes from bad sleep over long periods. We'd settled in his living room, coffee in hand, and Briggs had gotten straight to the point. "You're experiencing the count problem," he'd said. It wasn't a question. Foster had nodded. "Multiple operations. Consistent pattern. We need to know what you know." Briggs had taken a long drink of coffee, as if fortifying himself. "What I know is that there's something in that corridor that doesn't want to be seen. Or maybe it does want to be seen, but only on its own terms. I worked at that sector for 3 years before I requested a transfer. In that time, I ran Overwatch on probably 40 operations in that area, and I'd say 30 of them had some kind of anomaly." "What kind of anomalies?" I'd asked. Count discrepancies were the most common. Always more thermal signatures than visible people. The extra signatures were always cooler than normal human temperature. They'd move with the groups we were tracking, but not consistently. Sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes right in the middle. He'd paused. Sometimes multiple extra signatures. The worst one I saw was a group of 5 smugglers with 8 thermal readings. 3 extra signatures. I'd felt my mouth go dry. "Did you ever get a visual on any of the extras?" Foster had asked. "Once," Briggs had said quietly. "That's why I transferred." He'd set down his coffee and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. It was a solo crossing, just one person moving through the corridor in the middle of the night. On thermal, I had 2 signatures, the person and something following about 10 meters behind. I called it in, but ground units were 20 minutes out. I decided to move closer, see if I could get a visual identification on the second signature. Briggs had stopped, and I could see him struggling with the memory. I moved down from my overwatch position to about 50 meters from the targets, got behind a rock outcropping with good cover, the single person passed by, young guy, probably early 20s, carrying a backpack. He looked terrified, kept looking over his shoulder, and about 10 seconds after he passed my position, the second signature came by. "What did you see?" Foster had asked. "Nothing," Briggs had said. "That's the thing, there was nothing there. But I felt it pass. Temperature dropped maybe 40 degrees in an instant. My breath was visible in front of my face, and I heard, I don't know how to describe it. Not footsteps. More like the absence of sound, if that makes any sense. Like silence that had weight to it." He'd looked at both of us, making sure we understood. On my thermal scope, I could see it clearly. Human-shaped, bipedal, moving at a walking pace. But when I looked with my own eyes, even with night vision, there was nothing there except cold air. "What happened after it passed?" I'd asked. I stayed behind that rock until ground units arrived and picked up the runner. Told them I'd had an equipment malfunction and couldn't leave my position. Then I drove back to Douglas, went straight to my supervisor, and requested a transfer to any position that wasn't border operations. Told them I was burnt out, needed a change. They granted it within a week. Foster had pulled out his notebook. "Did you ever try to find out what it was? Historical research, consulting with anyone?" I talked to a few of the old-timers, agents who'd worked the border back in the 70s and 80s. The ones willing to discuss it at all said the same thing. There are places on the border where the instruments don't work right, where counts don't match, where experienced agents get turned around and lost. Most of them said you just learn which areas to avoid if you can. But we can't avoid it, Foster had pointed out. That corridor is a major smuggling route. We have to maintain operations there. Then you're going to keep experiencing the anomalies, Briggs had said flatly. Whatever is out there, it's not going away. It's been there longer than the DEA, longer than Border Patrol, probably longer than the border itself. The smugglers know about it. Why do you think they use that route despite the increased enforcement? Because they know something follows them, and they know it scares the hell out of our agents. We'd left Phoenix with more questions than answers. The drive back to Douglas had been mostly silent, both of us processing what Briggs had told us. Finally, as we approached the city limits, Foster had spoken. "We need to run another operation, but this time we do it differently." "How so?" "We set up multiple observation points with overlapping coverage. Full video recording on all equipment. Temperature sensors at ground level. We document everything. If there's a phenomenon, we gather data on it. Real, empirical data that can't be dismissed as equipment failure or observer error." I'd understood what he wasn't saying. We were going to try to prove that something impossible was happening. And if we succeeded, if we got documentation that couldn't be explained away, then what? But I'd also understood that we didn't have a choice. Whatever was in that corridor, it was affecting operations, potentially putting agents at risk. We needed to understand it. "When do we set this up?" I'd asked. "Intel suggests another movement next week. Same route, same timing. We'll have 6 days to prepare." Foster had glanced over at me. "Are you in?" I'd thought about Briggs, hiding in Phoenix, still haunted by what he'd seen, or hadn't seen. I'd thought about the cold spot that had followed Dalton. I'd thought about those thermal signatures, always one or two more than the visible count. "I'm in," I'd said, because by then I needed to know, even if the answer was something that would keep me awake for the rest of my life. The next 6 days were a flurry of quiet preparation. Foster had secured additional surveillance equipment through channels that didn't require detailed explanations. Thermal cameras, night vision rigs, temperature sensors, audio recording equipment, even an old video camera that one of the techs swore could capture infrared better than anything digital. We'd set up 3 observation posts instead of 1, forming a triangle around the corridor with overlapping fields of view. I'd take the primary position on the ridge, same as before. Foster himself would man a secondary position to the east, and we'd brought in Agent Martinez, a veteran operator Foster trusted, for the 3rd position to the west. We don't brief this widely, Foster had told us during our private planning session. As far as official channels know, we're running a standard interdiction with enhanced observation for training purposes. What we're really doing stays between us until we have something concrete. Martinez had looked skeptical. And if we don't find anything unusual, then we have documentation of a clean operation, Foster had replied. But based on the pattern, I expect we'll see anomalies. The night of the operation arrived cold and clear. I'd hiked up to my position 3 hours before the expected crossing time, giving myself plenty of setup time. The new equipment was more extensive. I had 3 thermal cameras at different angles, 2 night vision scopes, a laser rangefinder with built-in temperature sensor, and a digital audio recorder with a highly sensitive microphone. I'd also brought something else, a regular digital camera with a good low-light sensor set on a tripod aimed at the corridor. If something was there that thermal could see, but night vision couldn't, maybe a long-exposure photograph would catch something. At 0145 hours, Martinez radioed in. West observation post set and ready, all equipment functioning normally. Foster followed a moment later. East observation post set and ready. I'm getting baseline temperature readings. Ambient air temperature is 41 degrees, ground temperature is 37 degrees. I'd checked my own readings. Same numbers. We had our baseline. At 2:17 hours, they came. Contact, I'd reported, keeping my voice steady. Thermal shows 10 individuals moving north through the corridor. Distance approximately 2,200 meters. Night vision shows 8 individuals. West Post confirms thermal contact, Martinez had radioed. I'm showing 10 heat signatures as well. East Post confirms, Foster had added. 10 on thermal, 8 on night vision. The discrepancy is consistent across all observation points. 2 extra thermal signatures. I'd felt my pulse quicken as I began recording on all cameras. The group had moved in their characteristic single-file formation, the 8 visible people carrying heavy loads, moving at a steady pace. But the 2 extra thermal signatures were behaving differently than I'd seen before. They were flanking the group, 1 on each side, moving parallel to the line of smugglers but offset by about 15 meters. And they were moving in a pattern. Forward, then stopping, then forward again, like they were patrolling or watching. Control, the 2 extra signatures are not integrated with the main group, I'd reported. They're moving in a parallel pattern on either side, behavior consistent with security or surveillance. West Post confirms, Martinez had said. They're definitely not moving like they're part of the smuggling group, more like they're escorting. I'd zoomed in on one of the extra signatures with my highest resolution thermal camera. The heat pattern was wrong. Normal human thermal imaging shows hotspots at the core and joints, with cooler extremities. These signatures showed an almost uniform temperature throughout, and that temperature was reading at 88 degrees, nearly 10 degrees cooler than body temperature. Temperature readings on the extra signatures are 88 degrees Fahrenheit, I'd reported, consistent with previous observations. As the group approached the interdiction point, I'd triggered the long exposure photograph, letting the camera collect light for 10 seconds. In the viewfinder, I could see the 8 visible people, slightly blurred from movement. But there was something else in the frame, faint, almost like a distortion in the air, flanking the group on both sides. The interdiction had begun at 0243 hours. Our ground units had moved in from the north and south simultaneously, lights and sirens cutting through the desert night. The 8 smugglers had scattered as expected, but the 2 extra thermal signatures had done something I'd never seen before. They'd moved toward the ground units. "Control, both extra signatures are approaching the interdiction team," I'd reported, watching through the thermal scope. "They're not fleeing. They're moving directly toward agents." I'd watched as one signature approached our northernmost vehicle. The agent there, Jackson, a 15-year veteran, had been securing one of the suspects when the signature moved to within a few feet of him. On the radio, Jackson's voice had cut in. "Control, I've got an extreme temperature drop at my position. My hands are going numb. Unit 4, move away from your current position," Foster had ordered. But Jackson hadn't moved immediately. Through my night vision, I could see him looking around, confused, trying to locate the source of the cold. Then I'd seen his expression change, pure fear, sudden and overwhelming. "There's something here," Jackson had said over the radio, his voice shaking. "I can't see it, but I can feel it. It's right in front of me." "Unit 4, move now," Foster had commanded. Jackson had stumbled backward, nearly falling, then turned and ran to the next vehicle over. On my thermal scope, I'd watched the signature follow him for a few steps, then stop. The second signature had approached Agent Keene, who was securing the perimeter on the south side. I'd watched as it moved to within arm's reach of her. "Unit 7, I'd called over the radio. "You have an extreme cold source approaching your position from the southwest. Recommend moving east." "Copy that," Keene had responded, but there was confusion in her voice. "I don't see... Wait, yes, I feel it. Temperature just dropped, moving east." She'd walked away quickly, and the signature hadn't followed her. Instead, both signatures had moved back toward the center of the interdiction zone, where the 8 smugglers were being processed. Then they'd done something that made my blood run cold. They'd started moving among the suspects, passing between them, around them, as if inspecting them. And each time one of the signatures got close to a smuggler, I'd see the person react, flinching, looking around nervously, sometimes trying to move away, even with agents holding them. "East Post," Foster had radioed. "Are you recording this?" "Affirmative," Martinez had responded. "All cameras running. I've never seen anything like this." One of the suspects, a younger man, had started shouting in Spanish. Through my night vision, I could see him fighting against the agent holding him, real panic in his movements. "What's he saying?" Foster had asked. Agent Rodriguez, who spoke fluent Spanish, had translated. "He's saying, 'They're here, they came with us, he's terrified.'" The 2 thermal signatures had continued their inspection of the suspects for almost 2 minutes. Then, simultaneously, they'd moved away from the interdiction zone, not north like before. South, back the way they'd come. "Control, both signatures are moving south," I'd reported. "Speed consistent with a fast walk, they're heading back across the border." I'd tracked them on thermal as they moved back through the corridor. They'd maintained their flanking positions, moving parallel to each other about 30 meters apart. At 0251 hours, they'd reached the edge of my thermal range, and then they'd stopped. Just stopped, right at the border, and stood there. "Control, both signatures have stopped at approximately the border line," I'd reported. "They're stationary, facing north." For 5 minutes, they'd just stood there. 2 heat signatures, invisible to the naked eye, standing on the border like sentries. Then, at 0256 hours, they'd started moving south again, gradually fading from thermal range as they crossed into Mexico. The debriefing had lasted until dawn. 8 suspects in custody, confirmed. 8 bundles of methamphetamine recovered, confirmed. But the video footage, the thermal recordings, the audio, all of it documented something that shouldn't exist. Foster had gathered the core team in a secure room. Myself, Martinez, Jackson, Keene, and Rodriguez. He'd closed the door and pulled down the shades before speaking. What we experienced tonight goes beyond standard operational parameters, he'd said carefully. I need to know what each of you observed, without interpretation, just facts. One by one, we'd given our reports. Jackson described the cold that had paralyzed his hands, the feeling of being watched by something invisible. Keene reported a temperature drop of at least 40 degrees in a matter of seconds, and a sense of pressure in the air, like standing too close to something large. Rodriguez had translated more of what the suspects said, and it was consistent. They'd known something was with them, had been with them the whole journey north. Los acompañantes, Rodriguez had translated. The escorts. Multiple suspects used that term, like it's something known, something expected. Martinez had pulled up the thermal footage on his laptop. Even in the bright office with morning sun streaming through the cracks in the shades, watching that video gave me chills. You could see them so clearly on thermal. Two distinct figures moving with purpose, approaching our agents, inspecting the suspects. Temperature analysis from all three posts confirms consistent readings, Martinez had said, pulling up a graph. Both extra signatures maintained 88 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the observation period. That's 10 degrees cooler than human core temperature, but warm enough to show clearly on thermal imaging. Could it be equipment malfunction? Keene had asked, but there was no real belief in her voice. 3 separate observation posts with independent equipment, Foster had replied. Multiple types of sensors, all showing the same thing at the same time. And we have physical effects, measurable temperature drops experienced by multiple agents. He'd pulled up the long exposure photograph I'd taken. In the daylight office, we could see what I'd only glimpsed in the camera's viewfinder. Faint distortions in the air, vaguely human-shaped, flanking the line of smugglers. Like heat shimmer, but wrong somehow. Darker instead of lighter. "What are we looking at?" Jackson had asked quietly. None of us had an answer. Foster had closed his laptop and looked at each of us in turn. "This goes to the regional director. I'm filing a full report including all video and sensor data. But I need to know, are all of you comfortable with your names being on this documentation?" It was a fair question. Reporting something like this could damage careers, make us targets for ridicule or worse. But we'd all experienced it. We'd all seen the evidence. "I'm in," Martinez had said first. The others had followed, including me. "All right," Foster had said. "I'll have the report ready by tomorrow. In the meantime, operational security on this is absolute. We don't discuss it outside this room until we know how the brass is going to handle it." But the report had never made it to the regional director. The next morning, Foster had called me into his office. His expression had been carefully neutral, but I'd seen tension around his eyes. "The report's been kicked back," he'd said without preamble. Technical services reviewed the footage and sensor data. Their assessment is equipment malfunction across all systems simultaneously, combined with environmental factors causing false readings. "That's bullshit," I'd said. "We had independent verification from multiple sources." "I know, but that's the official determination." Foster had pulled out a memo. "Effective immediately, the Douglas Sector corridor is being reassigned for observation patterns. We're moving our interdiction operations 15 miles west." I'd felt something cold settle in my stomach. "They're burying it. They're removing the problem," Foster had corrected. "If we're not operating in that corridor, we won't keep generating reports of anomalous phenomena. Out of sight, out of mind. And the smugglers? We'll keep using that route knowing we're not watching it anymore." Foster had rubbed his face, suddenly looking exhausted. I pushed back, Reyes. I told them we had clear evidence of something that needs investigation. You know what they told me? That the DEA is a law enforcement agency, not a paranormal research team. That our job is interdicting drug shipments, not chasing ghosts in the desert. So, we just give up? We follow orders. Foster had looked at me. But I'm keeping copies of everything. The footage, the sensor data, the audio recordings. Not on DEA servers. Those files have already been wiped. But I've got personal copies stored securely, because someday someone is going to want to know the truth about what happens in that corridor. That had been 3 months ago. Now, sitting in my apartment late at night, I can't stop thinking about those thermal signatures. About the way they moved, the way they inspected the suspects, the way they stood at the border like guards at a checkpoint. Los acompañantes, the escorts. I'd done more research in my off hours. Talked quietly with some of the older agents, the ones who'd worked the border back before everything was digital. A few had been willing to talk, always privately, always off the record. One old-timer named Garrett, who'd retired in 2003, had told me about an operation in 1987 where his team had chased a group of 10 crossers into the desert and only found 9. The 10th had vanished, but they'd found his tracks leading to a spot where the sand was ice cold, even in the middle of summer. The tracks stopped there. Just stopped, like he'd been picked up and carried away. Another former agent, a woman named Pierce, who'd worked the sector in the 90s, had described an almost identical phenomenon to what I'd experienced. Count discrepancies, cold spots, thermal signatures that didn't match visual observations. She'd transferred to the Houston office in '88 and never looked back. The desert takes what it wants, Pierce had told me. The cartels know it, the coyotes know it. Hell, even the migrants know it. That's why you see those shrines along the routes, those little crosses and offerings. They're not just for the people who died of thirst, they're for the ones who got taken. Taken by what? I'd asked. Pierce had just shaken her head. By whatever's been there longer than us. Longer than the border. Longer than the towns. Maybe longer than we've been walking upright. The Tohono O'odham have stories about that area, if you can get them to tell you. Spirits that guard the crossing places. Beings that exist between worlds. I'd tracked down a Tohono O'odham elder through a contact in the Cultural Liaison Office. He'd been reluctant to talk at first, but when I described what I'd seen, carefully, without mentioning the DEA or operations, he'd nodded slowly. The Wedina, he'd said, the cold ones. They've always been in that place, since before my grandfather's grandfather. They walk between the hot world and the cold world, and sometimes they can be seen by machines, but not by eyes. Why are they there? I'd asked. They guard the crossing, not the border that men made. The old crossing, the one that's been there since the beginning. Some say they take those who aren't meant to cross. Others say they escort the dead back to where they came from. He'd looked at me with some eyes that had seen many things. What did you see, Agent? I'd told him, not everything, but enough. He'd been quiet for a long time. Then, they're showing themselves more now. That means something is changing. Something is coming. I'd tried to ask what he meant, but he'd made it clear the conversation was over. Now, weeks later, I still don't have real answers. The DEA has officially closed the book on the corridor anomalies. We're running operations in different sectors, and the reports of weird phenomena have stopped. Not because the phenomena stopped, but because we're not looking anymore. But the smugglers still use that route. Intel reports suggest traffic through the corridor has actually increased since we stopped running operations there. Like the cartels know we're avoiding it. And sometimes, late at night, I pull up the thermal footage on my personal laptop. I watch those 2 signatures moving among the suspects, inspecting them, evaluating them. I watch them standing at the border, facing north like sentries, and I wonder, what were they guarding? What were they looking for? And why did they start showing themselves to us only in the last few years? I should have left it alone. Should have accepted the official explanation, moved on to other operations in other sectors, focused on the job I was trained to do. That's what Foster had advised during our last conversation before he took a position in the Phoenix office. Sometimes, Reyes, we encounter things we're not equipped to understand, he'd said. The smart play is to document what you can and let it go. Don't let it consume you. But it already had consumed me. 3 months of avoiding the corridor. 3 months of running operations in sectors that made tactical sense but felt wrong somehow, like we were deliberately looking away from something important. The nightmares had started about 6 weeks after our last documented operation. Always the same. I'm back on that ridge, watching through the thermal scope, but this time there are dozens of the cold signatures. Hundreds of them moving north through the corridor, and when I try to count them, the numbers keep changing. 7 becomes 9, becomes 13, becomes 24, and no matter how many times I count, I can't get the same number twice. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the image of those thermal readings burned into my mind. It was Agent Martinez who finally brought it back into focus. He'd called me on a Saturday morning in late February, his voice tight with something that might have been fear or excitement or both. Reyes, I need you to come to my place. Now. Don't tell anyone you're coming. I'd driven to his house in Sierra Vista, about 30 miles north of Douglas. Martinez had met me at the door, looking like he hadn't slept in days. I've been monitoring the corridor, he'd said, leading me to what he'd converted into a home office. Off the clock, on my own equipment. I needed to know if the phenomena continued after we stopped official operations. The office was filled with equipment. Thermal cameras, radio scanners, computer monitors showing various data feeds. Martinez had essentially built his own observation post. Jesus, Martinez, I'd said. If Foster knew about this, Foster knows, Martinez had interrupted. I brief him weekly, unofficially. He suggested I might want to maintain monitoring for training purposes. That had surprised me, but it made sense. Foster had always been thorough, always the type to keep an eye on loose ends, even when ordered to leave them alone. What have you been seeing? I'd asked. Martinez had pulled up a series of thermal recordings, each one time-stamped over the past 2 months. The crossings have increased in frequency. We're seeing activity in that corridor almost nightly now, and the thermal anomalies are present in approximately 90% of observations. He'd played one recording. Clear thermal footage of a group of 12 people moving north through the corridor. Flanking them were 4 of the cold signatures, 2 on each side, moving in that same patrol pattern we'd observed before. It's escalating, Martinez had said. Not just in frequency, but in number. The first operations we ran, we saw 1 or 2 extra signatures. Now, we're regularly seeing 4 to 6. Last week, I recorded a crossing with 8 visible people and 14 thermal signatures. 14. 6 more than the people we could actually see. What do you think it means? I'd asked. I think something is building, Martinez had replied. And I think we need to understand what before it's too late. He'd pulled up a map of the corridor, marked with dates and numbers. Look at the pattern. The anomalies cluster around the old town site, Dos Cruces, and they're most intense during certain lunar phases. I'd studied the map, he was right. The highest concentrations of cold signatures appeared within a 3-mile radius of where Dos Cruces used to stand, and the most active nights corresponded to the new moon. "The next new moon is in 4 days," Martinez had said. "I want to go out there. Not as an official operation, just observation. I want to be on the ground when it happens, not watching from a distance." Every instinct I had screamed that this was a bad idea. We weren't authorized to be in that sector. We'd be going in with no backup, no support, investigating something that the agency had officially declared didn't exist. "I'm in," I'd heard myself say. We'd spent the next 3 days preparing. Martinez had access to excellent equipment through his personal contacts: military-grade thermal imaging, high-sensitivity audio recorders, electromagnetic field detectors, even a UV light system in case something showed up in that spectrum. "We're not ghost hunters," Martinez had said as we packed the gear. "We're scientists gathering data on an unexplained phenomenon. If it turns out there's a rational explanation, great. But if not..." He'd left the sentence unfinished. We both knew there was no good ending to that thought. The night of the new moon, we'd driven out to the corridor in Martinez's personal truck, taking back roads and avoiding the main border patrol checkpoints. Not that we were doing anything illegal. We were still federal agents, even off-duty. But we didn't want to explain what we were doing to anyone who might report back to Douglas Sector Command. We'd set up our observation post about a quarter-mile north of the old Dos Cruces site, in a shallow depression that gave us cover while maintaining a good view of the corridor. The temperature had dropped into the low 30s, cold enough that our breath misted in the air. "Thermal baseline is reading 32 degrees ambient," Martinez had reported, checking his instruments. "EM field is normal. UV is showing nothing unusual." We'd settled in to wait. The desert at night is never truly silent. There's always the wind, always the small sounds of animals moving through the brush. But that night felt different. Heavier somehow, like the air itself was holding its breath. At 0134 hours, Martinez had stiffened. "I'm getting EM fluctuations, small spikes, irregular pattern." I checked my thermal scope. Nothing yet, just the cold desert floor and rocks radiating their stored heat. The EM spikes had continued, growing stronger. Martinez's detector was showing readings that spiked and dropped, with no apparent source. And then, at 0147 hours, they'd appeared. Not from the south, crossing the border, from the ground itself. I'd been watching through thermal when the first cold signature had simply materialized in the middle of the corridor, like something rising from beneath the earth, 88 degrees, human-shaped, standing absolutely still. "Martinez," I'd whispered. "Are you seeing this?" "Confirmed," he'd replied, his voice shaking slightly. "Thermal signature appearing without source point. That's not possible." But it was happening. As we watched, more signatures had appeared. One by one, they'd risen from the ground or materialized from the air. Each one the same temperature. Each one standing motionless once it fully formed. By 151 hours, there were 23 of them. 23 cold signatures arranged in a rough circle around what we estimated was the center of old Dos Cruces. "Are you recording this?" I'd asked. "Everything," Martinez had confirmed. "Video, thermal, EM readings, audio, it's all being documented." For 10 minutes, the signatures had just stood there in their circle. Then they'd started moving. Not in formation like we'd seen before. They were moving in patterns, weaving between each other, like some kind of dance or ritual. And as they moved, the EM readings had spiked dramatically. "I'm showing EM fluctuations off the scale," Martinez had reported. "Whatever these things are, they're generating massive electromagnetic fields." Through my thermal scope, I'd watched as the pattern became more complex. The cold signatures were now moving in concentric circles, rotating in opposite directions, creating a pattern that was almost hypnotic to watch. And then the temperature had dropped. Not gradually, instantly. One moment it was 32 degrees. The next it felt like we'd been thrown into a freezer. I'd seen my breath crystallize in front of my face, felt frost forming on the equipment. Temperature just dropped 40 degrees in under 5 seconds. Martinez had gasped. That's not physically possible. But it had happened. According to his sensors, the ambient temperature in our immediate area was now -8 degrees Fahrenheit. And we could feel it. A cold so intense it burned, cutting through our jackets like they were paper. The cold signatures had stopped their movement. They were all facing inward now, toward the center of their circle. And something was happening there. The ground in the center of the circle was glowing. Not with light, I couldn't see anything through my night vision. But on thermal, there was a heat signature rising from the earth itself, growing brighter, hotter, expanding. Ground temperature at the center point is reading over 200 degrees, Martinez had reported, his voice high with disbelief. It's like there's fire underground, but there's no visible light source. The heat signature had continued to grow, forming a column that extended upward from the ground. And the cold signatures had begun to move again, but differently now. They were bowing or kneeling, or performing some gesture of obeisance toward the heat column. That's when we'd heard the sound. It wasn't human, it wasn't animal, it was something else entirely, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself, felt more than heard. It made my teeth ache and set off a primal fear response in my brain that screamed at me to run. "What is that?" Martinez had whispered. I'd had no answer. The sound had continued, rising and falling in pitch, almost like speech but in a register and pattern that human vocal cords couldn't produce. And the cold signatures had responded to it, moving in synchronization with the sound. Then, at 0203 hours, they'd all turned to face north. All 23 signatures, moving as one, orienting toward the border. And they'd started walking, not in a line or formation, in a wave. They'd moved through the corridor together, a wall of cold signatures sweeping north, and as they moved, the temperature had dropped even further. "They're coming toward us," Martinez had said, panic creeping into his voice. "Reyes, they're heading straight for our position." We'd had about 30 seconds to decide. Run or hold position and see what happened. I'd made the decision. We hold. We're here to observe. We observe. The wall of cold signatures had swept over us like a breaking wave. Through thermal, I'd seen them pass through our position, through us, moving north without pause or deviation. And as they passed, I'd felt it. That same sensation Jackson had described, that Keene had reported. Like being touched by something that existed in a space slightly offset from normal reality. The temperature had been beyond cold. It was the absence of heat, the antithesis of warmth. Something that shouldn't be able to exist at the temperatures Martinez's sensors were recording. But more than that, I'd felt awareness, intelligence, purpose. They'd known we were there. They'd known we were watching. And they'd made a choice to pass through our position rather than around it. It was a message, a warning, or a test, or maybe just an acknowledgement. But it was deliberate. The wave had passed in less than 20 seconds. As the last signature moved north beyond our position, the temperature had begun to rise again. Not to normal, we were still well below freezing, but the killing cold had passed. I'd checked my thermal scope, tracking them as they moved north. At approximately the point where the border fence stood, they'd stopped, and one by one, they'd sunk into the ground and disappeared. By 0207 hours, they were gone. The temperature had returned to normal. The EM readings had stabilized. It was as if nothing had happened. except for the frost that covered all of our equipment and the recordings that showed the impossible. Martinez and I had sat in silence for a long time after that, both of us shaking, from cold, from fear, from the sheer impossibility of what we'd witnessed. Finally, Martinez had spoken. "We need to show this to Foster." "We need to show this to someone," I'd agreed. "But I don't think the DEA is going to accept it any more now than they did before." "Then who?" That was the question. Who do you take evidence of the impossible to? We'd packed up our equipment as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. The drive back to Sierra Vista had been mostly silent, both of us lost in our own thoughts. At Martinez's house, we'd reviewed the footage. Everything we'd witnessed was there on video, the cold signatures appearing from nowhere, the movement patterns, the heat column, the wave passing north. But there was something else on the recordings that we hadn't noticed in real time. When we slowed down the footage of the wave passing through our position, frame by frame, there was a moment, just a single frame, where something appeared. Not the cold signatures. Something else. In that one frame, there was an image that looked almost like a face. Features that were almost human but not quite. Distorted in a way that hurt to look at. And beneath it, barely visible, what might have been text. Symbols that resembled letters but weren't part of any alphabet I recognized. Martinez had enhanced the image as much as possible. The symbols became clearer but no more understandable. "It's trying to communicate," Martinez had said quietly. "Whatever this phenomenon is, it's not just random. It has intelligence, it has purpose, and it's trying to tell us something." I'd stared at those symbols for a long time, feeling the weight of what we'd discovered. We'd gone looking for evidence of an unexplained phenomenon. What we'd found was proof of something beyond our framework of understanding. Something that existed in the space between Mexico and the United States, between heat and cold, between visible and invisible. "What do we do with this?" I'd asked. Martinez had looked at me, and I'd seen my own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. "I don't know, but we can't do nothing." That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, I've been gathering everything I can find about the corridor, about Dos Cruces, about the history of the region, the reports, the stories, the legends, all the pieces that don't fit into official narratives. And I've been thinking about what that elder had said. They're showing themselves more now. That means something is changing. Something is coming. What if the increasing frequency of sightings isn't random? What if it's building to something? And what if we're supposed to be paying attention? I haven't filed any official reports. Neither has Martinez. We've kept the recordings secure, copied to multiple encrypted locations, but we haven't shown them to anyone in authority. Because we both know what would happen. They'd be dismissed, buried, explained away. But we've sent copies to a few people we trust. Foster has them. Briggs in Phoenix has them. A handful of other agents who've reported similar experiences have them. We're building a network, quietly, of people who know the truth about the corridor. Because eventually, this is going to reach a critical point. Eventually, whatever is building out there is going to manifest in a way that can't be ignored or explained away. And when that happens, someone is going to need to understand what they're dealing with. Los acompañantes. The escorts. The cold ones, the Wedina. They've been there longer than the border. Longer than the towns. Maybe longer than we've been walking upright. And they're showing themselves now for a reason. I go back sometimes, to the corridor. Not officially, just to watch, and they're always there now, visible on thermal even during the day, cold signatures moving through the desert, following the same paths they've followed for longer than anyone can remember. Sometimes I think about approaching them, getting close enough to truly see what they are, to understand their purpose. But something stops me every time. Some primal survival instinct that recognizes a boundary that shouldn't be crossed. Last week, I received an encrypted message from an unknown sender. All it contained was a set of coordinates, the exact center of where Dos Cruces used to stand, and a date 3 weeks from now, the next new moon. I don't know who sent it, but I know I'm going to be there. Because whatever is coming, whatever these phenomena are building toward, it's connected to that place. And I need to know the truth, even if that truth is something that will keep me awake for the rest of my life. The desert doesn't lie. That's what they said in training. But they never told us what happens when the desert tells you the truth. And that truth is something you can't possibly accept. I've been working the border for 17 years. I've seen the worst humanity has to offer, the violence, the desperation, the cruelty of the cartels and the suffering of the people caught in their wake. I thought I understood the scope of what happens in the desert. I was wrong. Whatever is in that corridor, whatever those cold signatures represent, it's been there all along, watching, waiting, escorting the living or the dead, or something in between, across a border that exists on a different plane than the one we drew on maps. And now it's showing itself to us. The question I can't answer. Is it a warning, an invitation, or is it something else entirely? In 3 weeks, I'll be standing in the center of what used to be Dos Cruces, under a new moon, with nothing but a thermal camera and a lifetime of training that won't help me understand what I'm about to witness. And for the first time in my career, I'm genuinely afraid. Not of the smugglers, not of the cartels, not of the physical dangers that come with working the border. I'm afraid of what I'm going to learn about what actually exists out here in the dark. What's been here all along, invisible to our eyes but clear as day to our instruments. What's been keeping count. And I'm afraid because I think that whatever message they're trying to send, whatever those symbols meant in that single frame of video, we're almost out of time to understand it. 3 weeks until the new moon. 3 weeks until I find out what happens when you stop counting the people and start counting the things that follow them through the desert. 3 weeks until I learn whether we're the ones being monitored or whether something else has been filing reports on us all along. The desert doesn't lie. But sometimes the truth it tells is something we were never meant to hear. Radio silence is a tool, something you use deliberately, tactically, when the situation demands it. But what I experienced in the Big Bend sector wasn't radio silence. It was something else, something that made 12 years of DEA communications experience feel worthless. My name is Cole Harper, and I've been running tactical communications for border interdiction operations since 2008. Started in San Diego, moved through El Paso, finally ended up coordinating operations out of the Alpine Station in West Texas. The Big Bend region is different from other border sectors, more remote, more rugged, and with communications challenges that would make most urban operators quit on day one. Out here, we're dealing with mountain ranges that block signals, desert valleys that create dead zones, and atmospheric conditions that can turn crystal-clear transmissions into garbled noise without warning. I'd learned to work around all of it, building redundant systems, establishing relay points, mapping every frequency quirk in a 100-mile radius. I thought I'd seen every communications problem the desert could throw at me. I was wrong. This started in March 2020, right before the world went to hell with the pandemic. We'd been tracking a major smuggling operation for 6 weeks. High-value product, professional organization, routes that changed just enough to avoid pattern detection. Intelligence suggested they were moving shipments through the backcountry near Terlingua, using the old mining roads that most people had forgotten existed. The operation brief had been thorough. Senior Agent Wyatt, who ran the Alpine station, had assembled our best people for what he called a comprehensive interdiction effort. 12 agents, 4 vehicles, air support from a Border Patrol helicopter, and me coordinating communications from a mobile command post. "This is a big one, Harper," Wyatt had said during the final briefing. "These aren't small-time operators. They're moving pure product in quantities that suggest cartel connections. We need clean communications throughout the operation. No dropped signals, no confusion, no excuses." I'd nodded, confident in the system I'd built. We had primary frequencies for each team, backup channels, encrypted digital radios for sensitive communications, and even old-school analog backup units in case something went wrong with the digital network. Every possible failure point had a redundancy. "Comms will be solid," I'd assured him. "I've mapped every dead zone in the operational area. We've got relay stations positioned to cover any signal gaps. The teams will stay connected." The operation had launched at 2100 hours on a Thursday night. The plan was straightforward. 4 ground teams would position themselves along the suspected route, creating a net that would force the smugglers into a box canyon where we could safely intercept them. Air support would provide thermal imaging and real-time position updates. And I would coordinate everything from the mobile command post, a converted RV stuffed with communications equipment and monitoring stations. I'd set up on a plateau about 5 miles from the primary interdiction zone, a position that gave me line of sight to most of the operational area and good signal propagation. My equipment rack looked like something from a Cold War spy movie. Multiple radios, signal analyzers, frequency scanners, satellite uplinks, and a bank of monitors showing GPS positions of all our units. At 2130 hours, all 4 ground teams had reported in position. Radio check was clean, 5x5 signal strength across all frequencies. Air support was 15 minutes out. Everything was proceeding according to plan. "Command to all units, we are go for operation," I'd transmitted. "Maintain radio discipline and report any contacts immediately." The acknowledgments had come back crisp and clear. "Team 1, Roger. Team 2, copy that. Team 3, affirmative. Team 4, understood. Perfect communications." Just like I'd promised. At 2147 hours, Team 3 reported thermal contact. 6 individuals moving north through the target corridor, heavily loaded, maintaining tactical spacing. It was them. "Command copies, Team 3, I'd responded. "All units, target is moving north through Sector 7. Stand by for coordination." I'd watched the GPS markers on my screen, calculating intercept angles, preparing to guide the teams into position. Air support had just arrived on station, their thermal imaging confirming the contact. That's when I'd heard it. Just for a second, underneath Team 3's transmission. A sound that didn't belong. It was like static, but structured, rhythmic. Almost like Morse code, but the pattern was wrong. Too fast, too complex, not matching any standard I knew. "Team 3, say again your last transmission," I'd requested. "You're breaking up." "Command, this is 3. I said we have solid visual confirmation. 6 individuals, approximately 400 meters from our position. Request permission to move in." The transmission had been clear that time. No static, no interference. I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the first anomaly. "Team 3, hold position," I'd ordered. "Waiting for air support confirmation before we move." The helicopter pilot had come on the radio. "Air support to command, we confirm 6 targets moving north. Wait, I'm showing 7 thermal signatures now. Correction, target count is 7 individuals." I'd frowned, checking the digital feed from the helicopter's thermal system. The count flickered on my screen. 6, 7, 6, then air support. Your count is fluctuating on my display. Can you give me a solid number? Command, I'm looking at the thermal feed directly. I count, stand by. A pause. Confirm 7 individuals. Wait, now 6. There's some kind of interference with the imaging system. That was unusual, but not unprecedented. Thermal systems could glitch, especially with atmospheric conditions like heat shimmer or dust, but we had redundant visual confirmation from Team 3 on the ground. Team 3, confirm your visual count, I'd requested. The response had come back, but this time with that structured static underneath it. Louder now, more pronounced. Command, 3, visual, 6, no, 7, breaking up. The signal had degraded rapidly, going from 5 by 5 to barely intelligible in seconds, and that static pattern had become more prominent, almost drowning out the voice transmission. Team 3, you're breaking up. Switch to backup frequency Delta 7. I'd watched my signal analyzer as Team 3 switched frequencies. The backup channel should have been clean. I'd tested it that afternoon. But the moment they came up on the new frequency, the same structured static appeared, and it wasn't random interference. The pattern was repeating. A specific sequence of pulses and gaps, cycling every 12 seconds. All units, this is command. I'd transmitted on the primary frequency. I'm experiencing communications interference. Sound off with signal strength. Team 1, solid 5 by 5, command. Team 2, clear signal here, command. Team 3, command, barely, you, interference, Team Yacht 4. We copy you clearly, command. Only Team 3 was experiencing the interference. They were closest to the target group, maybe 300 meters away now. Everyone else had perfect communications. I'd pulled up a topographic map, checking for anything that might cause localized interference. There were no power lines, no radio towers, no military installations, nothing that should generate that kind of signal. Team 3, try to relay through Team 2, I'd instructed. See if we can get clear communication that way. Team 2 had come on the radio. Command, Team 2, we're attempting to raise Team 3 on backup channel, negative contact. We can see their position lights, they're approximately 1 click east of us, but we're not receiving their transmission. That was impossible. Team 2 and Team 3 were within visual range of each other. Line of sight. No obstacles. They should have been able to communicate using handheld radios with crystal clarity. Air support, can you establish communication with Team 3? The helicopter pilot had tried. Negative, command, I'm getting the same interference pattern you're hearing. It's like their signal is being jammed, but the jamming is selective. They can't reach us, but we're all communicating fine with each other. I'd felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. In 12 years of communications work, I'd never encountered anything like this. Interference that affected only specific transmissions, that appeared on multiple frequencies simultaneously, that had a structured pattern like someone was trying to send a message. Team 3, if you can hear me, acknowledge with 3 clicks on your transmit button. Nothing. Not even the structured static now. Just dead air on every frequency I tried. Team 2, move to Team 3's position and establish physical contact, I'd ordered. Something's wrong with their radio system. Team 2 had begun moving, and I'd watched their GPS marker approach Team 3's position. The 2 units converged on my screen. Then Team 2's radio had crackled to life. Command, this is 2. We're at Team 3's last known position. Their vehicle is here, but, command, the team isn't here. Say again, Team 2. The vehicle is here. Engine running, lights on, doors open. But there's no sign of the agents. Their radios are inside the vehicle, still powered on. But the team is gone. The cold knot in my stomach turned to ice. I'd keyed up the helicopter. Air support, thermal sweep of Team 3's position. Where are our people? Command, I'm showing. This doesn't make sense. I'm showing 4 heat signatures at the vehicle position, but Team 2 says the vehicle is empty. Team 2, are you seeing anyone at the vehicle? Negative, Command. The vehicle is completely empty. We're looking at the radios right now. They're keyed up, transmitting, but there's nobody here. 4 heat signatures, 4 agents had been in Team 3, and the thermal imaging showed them at the vehicle. But Team 2, standing right there, saw nothing. Air support. Are you certain about your thermal reading? Affirmative, Command. 4 distinct signatures right at the vehicle. Body temperature range. They're standing around the vehicle like they're waiting for something. This wasn't equipment malfunction. This was something else, something wrong. All units, halt your advance, I'd ordered. We're pulling back to reassess. That's when the structured static had come back. But this time, it wasn't underneath anyone's transmission. It was the primary signal, coming through loud and clear on every frequency simultaneously. And as I'd listened, frozen at my communications console, I'd realized something that made my hands shake. The pattern wasn't random. It wasn't interference. It was speech. Or something like speech. The pulses and gaps formed patterns that were too regular to be natural, too complex to be simple jamming. Someone, or something, was using our radio frequencies to transmit a message. I'd grabbed my signal analyzer, trying to decode the pattern. The software had started processing, running the signal through every known communications protocol. Military codes, commercial standards, amateur radio formats, emergency systems, nothing matched. But there was structure there, definite structure. Command, this is Team 2. The voice had been tight with tension. We're hearing something out here. Not on the radio. A sound in the air. Like humming. High-pitched. It's making our teeth hurt. Team 4 reporting the same. Another voice had cut in. Some kind of audible tone. It's getting louder. I'd heard it, too, faintly, coming from outside my mobile command post. A sound that seemed to vibrate at the edge of hearing, making the equipment racks buzz in sympathy. And the structured static on the radio had changed. The pattern had accelerated, the pulses coming faster, building to something. On my thermal feed from the helicopter, I'd watched as more heat signatures appeared around Team 3's abandoned vehicle. Not the 4 that matched our missing agents. New signatures, different temperatures, moving in patterns that didn't match human movement. Air support, how many signatures are you showing now? Command, I'm counting. 14, no, 17. They keep appearing. Temperature readings are inconsistent. Some are showing normal human range. Others are reading significantly cooler. 17 thermal signatures. 4 missing agents. And 13... what? All units, immediate withdrawal to Rally Point Alpha, I'd commanded. This operation is abort. We are leaving the area now. The responses had come back quickly. Everyone wanted out. Even the helicopter pilot, who'd seen plenty of weird things in his career, had sounded relieved to get the order to pull back. But as the teams had begun their withdrawal, the radio had gone completely dead. Not the structured static, not interference. Just absolute silence across every frequency, every channel, every backup system. The GPS tracking still showed the unit positions, but there was no voice communication at all. I'd tried everything. Different frequencies, different power levels, different antennas. The equipment was functioning. All indicators showed normal operation. But when I transmitted, nothing went out. And nothing came in. Radio silence that I hadn't ordered. Communications blackout with no apparent cause. For 5 minutes, I'd watched the GPS markers move across my screen as the teams withdrew, unable to talk to them, unable to coordinate, just hoping they'd stick to the training and get themselves out. Then, At exactly 2200 hours, the radio had come back. Not gradually, but instantly. 1 second dead air, the next second full communications capability. Command, this is Team 2. Do you copy? I'd grabbed the microphone. Team 2, command copies. Report status. We're clear of the operational area, heading to Rally Point Alpha. Command, what the hell just happened to our radios? I don't know, I'd admitted. But we're terminating this operation. Everyone rally at Alpha and we'll debrief there. The teams had pulled back to the rally point, a cleared area about 12 miles from the interdiction zone. When everyone was accounted for, I'd done a head count. 11 agents present. We'd started with 12. Team 3 was still missing. All 4 agents vanished from their vehicle while the engine was running and the doors were open. We'd called in search and rescue. Border Patrol, Sheriff's Department, even the Rangers. For 3 days, they'd searched every inch of the operational area. They'd found Team 3's vehicle exactly where Team 2 had reported it. The radios inside were still powered on, still set to our operational frequencies. But there was no sign of the 4 agents, no tracks leading away from the vehicle, no evidence of struggle. Just 4 people who'd vanished in the time it took for Team 2 to drive 1 kilometer. The official report had listed them as missing, presumed lost in the desert. A tragedy, but one that happens in border operations. People get disoriented, wander off, succumb to exposure. It's harsh country out there. But I'd listened to the recordings, hours of them, analyzing every second of transmission from that night. And I'd heard things that weren't in the official report. I'd heard the structured static, the pattern that repeated every 12 seconds. I'd heard Team 3's last transmission before the interference started, the one where the agent's voice had sounded wrong, flat, emotionless, like someone reading from a script they didn't understand. And I'd heard something else. At exactly 21:59 hours, 1 minute before total radio silence, there had been a transmission. Brief, barely audible, on a frequency we hadn't been using. It was a voice saying 4 words in perfect, unaccented English. The count is wrong. I'd played that snippet back 100 times, trying to identify the speaker. It wasn't any of our team. The voice didn't match anyone on the operation, but someone had transmitted it on our frequencies with our encryption codes from somewhere in that operational area. Someone who knew the count was wrong. And I kept coming back to that thermal imaging feed, showing 17 signatures where there should have been 6, or 7, or however many had actually been out there in the desert that night. Because the one thing I knew for certain, after 12 years of communications work, was this. When you can see something on thermal imaging but can't communicate with it, when your radios pick up structured patterns that don't match any known protocol, when 4 trained agents vanish without a trace while their radios keep transmitting, you're not dealing with equipment failure. You're dealing with something that understands our systems better than we do. Something that can manipulate our frequencies, our signals, our entire communications infrastructure. Something that knew we were coming and decided to send us a message. I just wish I knew what that message meant. The investigation into Team 3's disappearance consumed the next 2 weeks. Federal protocols, incident reports, interviews with every agent on the operation. They'd brought in technical specialists from Washington to examine the communications logs, trying to find a rational explanation for what had happened. I'd sat through 6 hours of questioning, walking investigators through every decision I'd made, every frequency I'd used, every backup system I'd activated. They'd been professional but skeptical, especially when I'd tried to explain the structured static pattern. Communications interference is common in that terrain. The lead investigator, a woman named Pierce from the FBI's Technical Crimes Division had said. Military exercises, atmospheric conditions, even solar flares can cause unusual patterns. This wasn't atmospheric, I'd insisted. I've worked border communications for 12 years. I know what natural interference sounds like. This was structured, deliberate. Pierce had pulled up the audio files on her laptop. I'm listening to your recordings now, Agent Harper. I hear static, random noise. The pattern you're describing isn't evident in the frequency analysis. I'd asked her to play it back. When she had, I'd heard exactly what she described. Random static, no pattern, just noise that could be explained by interference. But that wasn't what I'd heard that night. The pattern had been clear, repeating every 12 seconds, building to a crescendo before the total communications blackout. The files have been altered, I'd said. That's a serious accusation, Pierce had replied. These recordings are on encrypted DEA servers. They've been secured as evidence. If they'd been altered, we'd know. Would we? I'd wondered. If something could manipulate our communication systems in real time, selectively jamming certain transmissions while leaving others clear, could it also alter recordings after the fact? The thought had been paranoid, irrational, but after what I'd experienced, rationality felt like a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. The search for Team 3 had officially ended after 10 days. No bodies, no evidence of foul play, no leads to follow. The working theory was that they'd somehow gotten separated from their vehicle, become disoriented, and died somewhere in the vast expanse of the Big Bend backcountry. Recovery operations would continue, but the active investigation was closed. Except it wasn't. Not for me. I'd started going through old operations reports, looking for similar communications anomalies. What I found made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Over the past 5 years, there had been 8 separate incidents in the Big Bend sector where communications had failed in ways that couldn't be fully explained. Brief periods of interference, unexplained dead zones, transmissions that were heard by some units but not others. Each one had been written off. Atmospheric conditions, equipment malfunction, operator error. But there was a pattern to them. They all occurred in a relatively small geographic area, a corridor about 30 miles long that ran parallel to the border between Terlingua and the eastern edge of Big Bend National Park, the same corridor where Team 3 had vanished. I'd pulled up a map and marked each incident. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. And at the center of that pattern was an abandoned border station, a small outpost that had been decommissioned in 1994 when operations shifted to more centralized facilities. The old Esperanza Station. That's what it had been called. Hope Station. I'd found references to it in historical records at the Alpine office. It had been a small operation, just 6 agents, monitoring a remote section of the border that saw relatively light traffic. Active from 1979 to 1994, then closed when budget cuts forced consolidation of resources. But there was something odd in the closure reports. 3 of the 6 agents who'd been stationed there had requested transfers before the closure was official. 1 had taken early retirement. Another had filed a formal complaint about unacceptable working conditions, but had refused to elaborate on what those conditions were. The 6th agent, the station chief, had simply disappeared 3 months before the closure. Never found, presumed to have crossed into Mexico for reasons unknown. 5 agents who wanted out. 1 who vanished. I'd driven out to the Esperanza Station site one afternoon, taking a day off and telling no one where I was going. The road hadn't been maintained in over 20 years, barely more than a rough track through the desert. My truck bottomed out twice before I reached the station. The buildings were still there, mostly intact. 2 small barracks, a communications building, a garage, all surrounded by a sagging chain-link fence. The desert was slowly reclaiming everything, creosote bushes growing through cracked concrete, sand drifting against walls. I'd parked and walked the perimeter looking for, I didn't know what, signs of recent activity maybe. Some clue as to why this place seemed to be at the center of the communications anomalies. The main communications building had a steel door that was locked but rusted. A few kicks had popped it open. Inside, everything was exactly as it had been left in 1994. Desks still in place, filing cabinets full of yellowed reports, even an old coffee maker sitting on a counter. And on one wall, the original communications equipment. Ancient by today's standards, vacuum tube radios, analog signal processors, frequency analyzers that looked like museum pieces. None of it was powered, of course. The station had been off the grid for over 2 decades. I'd been about to leave when I'd noticed something odd. One of the old radios, a receiver unit from the 1980s, had a piece of paper taped to it. The tape had yellowed, but the paper was still readable. It was a frequency list, but not standard Border Patrol frequencies. These were unusual, high-band frequencies, some of them in ranges that weren't allocated for federal use. Each frequency had a notation next to it. Do not monitor, or interference pattern, or just no. At the bottom of the list, in handwriting that was shaky and hard to read, they talk on our frequencies. Stop listening, or you'll hear too much. I'd taken a photo of the list with my phone, then searched the rest of the building. In one of the filing cabinets, I'd found incident reports from '93, the year before the station closed. Multiple reports of communications problems. Structured interference on multiple frequencies. Transmissions that seemed to be in English but weren't, using familiar words in combinations that made no sense. And one report, filed by the station chief 2 months before he vanished, that made my blood run cold. The signal analysis suggests intelligence, not human. Recommend immediate investigation by technical specialists. Current communications protocols are compromised. There was a handwritten note at the bottom from whoever had reviewed the report. Psych evaluation recommended. Extreme stress apparent. The station chief had seen something, heard something, that had made him believe the interference wasn't natural. And instead of investigating, they'd sent him for psychological evaluation. 2 months later, he was gone. I'd left the Esperanza station as the sun was setting, feeling like I was being watched the entire drive back to the main road. Every time I checked my mirror, there was nothing behind me but empty desert. But the feeling had persisted. Back in Alpine, I'd started monitoring the frequencies from that yellowed list. Officially, I didn't have authorization to monitor those bands, but I had access to equipment that could, and I needed to know what was out there. For 3 nights, I'd picked up nothing unusual. Standard background noise, occasional civilian traffic, nothing that matched the structured patterns I'd heard during Team 3's operation. On the 4th night, at exactly 2200 hours, the same time communications had been restored during that operation, I'd heard it, the structured static, the 12-second repeating pattern, coming through loud and clear on one of the frequencies from the list. I'd recorded it, of course, set up every piece of analysis equipment I had access to, trying to decode what I was hearing. The pattern was complex, multi-layered. There were at least 3 distinct components overlapping: a carrier wave, a modulation pattern, and something else. Something that sounded almost like voice data but compressed or encrypted in a way I couldn't parse. I'd run it through every decryption algorithm I had access to. Military encryption, commercial standards, even some classified systems I technically shouldn't have been using. Nothing worked. But there was one thing I could determine. The signal was coming from the area around Esperanza Station. The abandoned outpost was transmitting, or something near it was. The next day, I'd requested a meeting with Senior Agent Wyatt. I'd brought printouts of the old incident reports, the frequency list, my recordings of the structured static. I'd laid it all out for him, trying to make the case that something beyond normal operations was happening in that corridor. Wyatt had listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When I'd finished, he'd leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment. "Harper, how long have you been working border communications?" 12 years, sir. "And in those 12 years, have you ever experienced psychological stress that made you question your perceptions?" The question had stung. "Sir, I'm not suffering from stress-related hallucinations. This is documented. The recordings show interference patterns that can be explained by atmospheric conditions and equipment limitations." Wyatt had tapped the printouts. "This historical information is interesting, but it doesn't prove anything except that the Big Bend sector has always had communications challenges. What about Team 3? 4 agents don't just vanish." "People do vanish in the desert, Harper. It's tragic, but it happens. The terrain is unforgiving. We may never find them." He'd push the documents back across the desk. "I'm going to say this as clearly as I can. You need to let this go. Team 3's disappearance is being handled by the appropriate authorities. Your job is to maintain communications for current operations, not to investigate historical anomalies that have already been explained." "They haven't been explained, sir. They've been dismissed." Wyatt's expression had hardened. "Agent Harper, I'm ordering you to drop this investigation. That's not a suggestion. If you continue pursuing this line of inquiry, I'll have to question whether you're fit for duty." The threat had been clear. Back off, or face the same psychological evaluation that had ended the career of the Esperanza Station chief. I'd gathered up my documents and left his office, but I hadn't stopped. I'd just become more careful about it. At night, after my official shifts ended, I'd been monitoring those frequencies. The structured static appeared regularly now, always at 2200 hours, always following the same 12-second pattern. But it was changing, evolving. Each night, the pattern became slightly more complex, as if it was adapting or learning. And I'd started hearing something else. Underneath the static, barely audible, what sounded like words. English words, but spoken in a rhythm that was off, wrong somehow. I'd isolated the audio, enhanced it, played it back at different speeds. At half speed, the words became clearer. Count, wrong. Count, always, wrong. The same message, repeating over and over. The same words that had come through on that unexplained transmission the night Team 3 vanished. Someone, or something, was trying to tell us that the count was wrong. But what count? The number of agents, the number of suspects, the thermal signatures that didn't match visual observations? I'd been working on this puzzle for 2 weeks when I'd received an anonymous text message. Just a phone number with a 505 area code, New Mexico, and a single word, call. I'd debated whether to respond. It could be anything, a wrong number, a prank, maybe even a test from the agency to see if I'd stopped investigating. But I'd called, at 2200 hours exactly, sitting in my truck on a dark stretch of highway outside Alpine. The phone had rung twice before someone picked up. No hello, no identification. Just a voice that sounded old and tired. "You've been monitoring the frequencies. Who is this?" I'd asked. "Someone who worked Esperanza Station, someone who knows what you're hearing." A pause. "The station chief, the one they said disappeared." My pulse had quickened. "You're supposed to be missing, dead probably. I chose to disappear. After I understood what was happening, I couldn't stay in the system. They would have buried me in psychological evaluations and forced medication. I needed to understand on my own terms. Understand what? Another pause, longer this time. You've heard the pattern, the 12-second cycle. You've heard the words underneath. The count is wrong. You know, something is out there, something that uses our communication systems to... Communicate isn't the right word. More like intrude, or maybe warn. Warn us about what? About what's in the desert. What's always been in the desert. But we're only now developing the technology to detect it. The thermal imaging, the radio frequencies we use, the GPS systems. We've built the tools to see what was invisible before, and it's showing itself to us now, deliberately. I'd wanted to believe he was crazy, that I was talking to a paranoid burnout who'd cracked under the stress of border work. But he knew about the pattern. He knew about the count. What happened to Team 3? I'd asked. The same thing that almost happened to me. The same thing that's happened to others over the years. You get too close to the source, you try to make contact, and you find out that the count isn't the only thing that's wrong. Space is wrong out there. Time is wrong. The closer you get to Esperanza, the less the normal rules apply. That's insane. Is it? You've seen the thermal signatures that don't match visual observation. You've experienced communications that work for some units but not others, even when they're standing next to each other. You've recorded patterns that can't be decoded by any system we have. What part of that is sane? He'd been right, of course. Nothing about this was sane. What do I do? I'd asked. Stop investigating. Walk away. Transfer to another sector. That's the smart play. A pause. But if you're going to keep pursuing this, and I can tell from your voice that you are, then you need to understand the rules. Don't go to Esperanza at 2200 hours. Don't try to respond to the transmissions. And don't ever trust your equipment when you're in that corridor. What your radios tell you, what your GPS shows you, what your thermal imaging displays, none of it is necessarily real when you're close to the source. Where are you? I'd asked. I need to meet with you, compare notes. I'm close enough to monitor what you're doing, far enough away that they can't find me. The voice had taken on a different quality, almost sad. The 4 agents from Team 3 aren't dead, Harper. They're not lost in the desert. They're somewhere else, somewhere adjacent to where we are. And every night at 2200 hours, they're trying to tell us where. The line had gone dead. I'd tried calling back immediately. The number was disconnected. I'd tried tracing it through DEA systems. Nothing. It was a burner phone, probably already destroyed. But the conversation had changed everything. The missing station chief, if that's really who I'd talked to, had confirmed what I'd been suspecting. This wasn't about equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference. There was something in that corridor that existed just outside our normal perception. Something that we could detect with technology but couldn't interact with directly. And it was using our own communication systems to send messages we couldn't decode. The count is wrong. That night, I'd pulled up every piece of data I had about Team 3's disappearance. The GPS logs, the radio transcripts, the thermal imaging feed from the helicopter. And I'd looked at it with fresh perspective, assuming that nothing was what it seemed. The GPS positions for Team 3's vehicle showed it stationary at one set of coordinates. But when I'd cross-referenced those coordinates with the helicopter's position data and the line-of-sight observations from Team 2, there was a discrepancy. Small, just a few dozen meters, but consistent. Team 3's vehicle had been in 2 places at once. The GPS said one location. Visual observation said another. Which one was real? I checked the timestamps on every transmission from that night. Most of them matched up perfectly. You could track the progression of events through the communications log. But there were gaps. Small ones, a few seconds here and there, where the timestamps jumped in ways that didn't quite make sense. As if time itself had hiccuped. And the thermal imaging feed, when I'd gone through it frame by frame, there was a moment just before the total communications blackout where all the signatures had been in different positions than they should have been. Not moving naturally from one position to another, but jumping. Discontinuous. The count was wrong because the count kept changing. The numbers didn't add up because the reality wasn't consistent. I'd been staring at data from a place where the normal rules didn't apply. And 4 agents had walked into that space without understanding what they were entering. Were they still alive? The former station chief had said they weren't dead. But if they weren't dead and weren't in our normal space, where were they? And could I bring them back? Against every instinct for self-preservation, I'd started planning a return to the corridor. Not an official operation, that would never be approved. A solo reconnaissance off the books, using personal equipment that wasn't monitored by the agency. I'd spent a week gathering gear, a portable communications rig, multiple GPS units, thermal cameras, audio recorders, even an old analog direction finder that didn't rely on digital processing. If the technology in that area was unreliable, maybe older, simpler systems would work better. I'd also created a dead man's switch. If I didn't check in every 2 hours, automated emails would be sent to Wyatt, to Pierce at the FBI, to 3 journalist contacts I'd cultivated over the years. The emails contained everything: the recordings, the historical reports, the analysis of Team 3's disappearance. If something happened to me, the information would get out. The night I chose was a Friday in late April. No operations scheduled in the sector. No legitimate reason for anyone to be near Esperanza. I'd told people I was taking a long weekend, driving up to Santa Fe to visit family. Instead, I'd driven to the corridor and arrived at the abandoned station at 2100 hours. 1 hour before the structured transmissions usually began. The station looked exactly as it had during my first visit, decaying buildings slowly being swallowed by the desert. But as I'd stepped out of my truck, I'd felt something different. A pressure in the air, like the atmospheric tension before a thunderstorm. Static electricity making my hair stand on end. I'd set up my equipment in the old communications building, arranging everything on the same desk where I'd found the frequency list. The building had no power, so I was running everything off portable generators and battery packs. Multiple recording devices, all synchronized, all set to capture whatever happened. At 2145 hours, I'd done a systems check. Everything was functioning normally. Clear communications to my truck radio, GPS showing accurate positions, thermal imaging displaying the expected background heat signatures of the desert cooling in the evening. I'd keyed my truck radio. Harper to base unit, radio check. My own voice had come back clear from the vehicle outside. Base unit to Harper, 5x5. Normal. Everything normal. At 2155 hours, the first anomaly had appeared. The digital clock on my communications rig had jumped forward 3 seconds, then corrected itself. The GPS units had briefly shown my position as being half a mile south of where I actually was, then snapped back to the correct coordinates. Hiccups. Reality glitching. At 2158 hours, the temperature in the building had dropped 10 degrees in about 5 seconds. My breath had become visible. The thermal camera had shown cold spots forming in the corners of the room, darker patches where the heat was being pulled away. And at 2200 hours exactly, the structured static had begun. But not on my radios. In the old vacuum tube receiver, the one that had been sitting dead for over 20 years. The one with no power source. It had lit up, tubes glowing orange, and the static had come through the ancient speaker. The 12-second pattern, loud and clear, but with something new layered into it. Voices, multiple voices, overlapping, speaking in English but with that wrong rhythm I'd heard in the recordings. Count wrong, count always wrong. Where are we? Time doesn't, can't find the way. Count wrong. I'd grabbed my audio recorder, making sure it was capturing everything. The voices were clearer in person than they'd ever been on any recording. They sounded desperate, confused. "This is Cole Harper," I'd said, keying my own radio. "I'm receiving your transmission. Can you identify yourselves?" The structured static had changed immediately. The 12-second pattern had broken, becoming more chaotic. And through the chaos, one of the voices had emerged clearly. "Harper, you're in the station. Don't stay. It pulls you in. The count." "Who is this?" I'd asked. "Are you from Team 3? "Team 3? Yes. Mason. Agent Mason. We're here, but not coordinates wrong. Everything wrong." Mason. That was Team 3's leader. But his voice sounded hollow, like it was coming from a vast distance. "Mason, what's your location? We've been searching for you." Location, not, "We're here, right here, but you can't see." Different frequency, different. The transmission had dissolved into static again, and when the pattern reformed, it was different. Not the 12-second cycle anymore, something longer, more complex. And in the background, I'd heard other sounds, not voices, more like the ambient noise of a space. Wind, maybe, or machinery, or something else entirely. I'd checked my GPS units. All three of them were showing different locations for my position. One said I was at Esperanza. One said I was 3 miles north. One said I was south of the border in Mexico. All three couldn't be right. The thermal camera had shown something impossible. The room I was in showed on the display, recognizable by the outlines of furniture and equipment. But overlaid on top of it was another space. Vague outlines of different furniture, different walls, like two locations occupying the same coordinates. And in that overlaid space, I'd seen them. 4 heat signatures, human-shaped, moving, alive. Team 3, existing in a version of the station that wasn't quite the same as mine. "Mason, I can see you on thermal imaging," I'd transmitted. 4 signatures. "Are all of you there?" The response had come through that old vacuum tube receiver. "All here, but here is wrong. Tried to count. Thermal showed too many. Went to check. Stepped through. Didn't know." Stepped through. Into what? Another space? Another frequency? A place where the normal rules didn't apply? I'd moved the thermal camera, scanning the building systematically. The 4 signatures were moving through rooms that didn't match the physical layout I could see. They'd walk through walls that existed in my space, following corridors that didn't exist here. "Mason, you need to navigate back to our frequency," I'd said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "Follow my voice. Use it as a guide." Tried. Can't find the way. The count keeps changing. Every time we think we're close. The structured static had surged then, becoming almost deafening, and through it, I'd heard other voices. Not the 4 from Team 3. Others, many others. "Been here since 93. Station chief. Can't find the exit. Border Patrol 07. Thermal showed something wrong. Went to investigate. Don't remember when. Long time. So long." How many people were trapped in that adjacent space? How many had stepped through over the years, drawn by the anomalies, thinking they could investigate and return? The building had started shaking. Not violently, but with a constant vibration, like standing next to a huge generator. My equipment had rattled on the desk, and dust had drifted down from the ceiling. I checked the time. 20 to 15 hours. 15 minutes since the structured transmission had started. How long did I have before whatever had pulled in Team 3 tried to pull me in too? Mason, listen carefully, I transmitted. You need to focus on a specific point. The doorway of the communications building. Can you see it? I see many doorways, all in same place but different. Focus on the one where my voice is strongest. Move toward it. Don't worry about walls or obstacles. Just move toward my voice. On the thermal display, I'd watched as the 4 signatures changed direction, moving toward my position. But they weren't getting closer in normal space. They were moving through that overlaid geometry, following paths that made no sense in my reality. The shaking had intensified. Items had started falling off shelves. One of my GPS units had sparked and died. The thermal camera display had flickered, showing the overlaid space more clearly for a moment before returning to the confused double image. And I'd seen them then. Not just Team 3. Dozens of heat signatures, all moving through that adjacent space, all trapped in geometries that didn't align with ours. A graveyard of people who'd gotten too close to understanding what was happening here. Harper, if you can hear us, don't try to come through. Warn others. The count is always wrong because there's more than one count, more than one space. Overlap point here. The transmission had cut out. Not gradually fading, just gone instantly. And the shaking had stopped. The temperature had normalized. The old vacuum tube receiver had gone dark. I'd checked my equipment. The one functioning GPS unit now showed the correct location. The thermal camera showed only normal background signatures. The digital clock was keeping accurate time. Everything back to normal, as if nothing had happened. Except my recordings. I'd checked them immediately. Every device had recorded the full event. The voices, the static patterns, the audio of our conversation. Proof that it had been real. I'd packed up quickly, suddenly aware of how alone I was out there. As I'd carried equipment to my truck, I'd used the thermal camera one more time, scanning the station. The building showed normal temperature patterns, but at exactly the point where I estimated Team 3 had been standing in that adjacent space, there was a cold spot. Just a small area, maybe 3 feet in diameter, where the temperature was 15 degrees lower than the surrounding desert. A marker, a sign that they were still there, still trying to find a way back. I'd driven away from Esperanza as the clock turned to 2300 hours. Behind me, in the rearview mirror, I could see the old station silhouetted against the desert sky, and I could swear I saw lights in the windows, faint, flickering, like candles or battery-powered flashlights. Lights that shouldn't be there in a building that had no power. Lights from the wrong frequency, bleeding through into ours. The recordings changed everything. I had proof, real, documented evidence that something impossible was happening in the corridor. Multiple formats, multiple devices, all showing consistent data that couldn't be dismissed as equipment malfunction. I'd spent the entire weekend analyzing the audio, breaking down the patterns, trying to understand what I'd documented. The structured static, when processed through spectral analysis software, showed regularities that strongly suggested artificial generation, not natural interference, not atmospheric phenomena, something created deliberately. And the voices. I'd isolated each one, run voice analysis, compared them to personnel records. Agent Mason from Team 3. Confirmed match. 2 other voices I'd managed to isolate also matched Team 3 members. They were alive, or something was using their voices, in that space adjacent to ours. But it was the other voices, the ones claiming to be from years past, that haunted me. I'd cross-referenced names and dates with missing person reports from the sector. Most matched. People who'd vanished near Esperanza, unexplained disappearances that had been written off as desert tragedies. They weren't dead. They were displaced. Monday morning, I'd gone straight to Wyatt's office with the recordings. I'd known it was a risk. He'd already ordered me to drop the investigation. But I had evidence now. Real evidence that couldn't be ignored. Wyatt had listened to the audio files, watched the thermal imaging video, reviewed the spectral analysis. His expression had remained neutral throughout, giving nothing away. When I'd finished presenting everything, he'd closed the files and looked at me for a long moment. "Harper, you went to Esperanza Station alone, off duty, without authorization, to investigate a phenomenon I specifically ordered you to stop pursuing." "Sir, I had to. You violated direct orders. You put yourself at risk. And you've brought me evidence that, if authentic, represents something far beyond our mandate to handle." He'd paused. "But more importantly, you've proven something I'd hoped wasn't true." That had surprised me. "Sir?" Wyatt had pulled a file from his desk drawer. A thick file, worn at the edges, marked with classification stamps I didn't recognize. "What you discovered isn't new, Harper. The phenomenon at Esperanza has been known about, at certain levels, since the station was active. The structured transmissions, the displacement of personnel, the overlapping geometries, it's all documented." He'd opened the file, showing me reports dating back to the 1980s. Incident after incident, all describing the same patterns I'd experienced. And at the top of each report, the same notation: "No action recommended. Phenomenon contained within acceptable parameters." "Contained?" I'd said, incredulous. 4 of our people are trapped in some kind of adjacent space, and that's considered contained? The phenomenon doesn't spread. It's geographically fixed to a small area around Esperanza. Personnel who avoid the site remain safe. From a risk management perspective, the containment strategy is to classify the area as hazardous and restrict access. That's not containment. That's abandonment. "We have people in there, sir. How many? How long?" Wyatt had closed the file. "We don't know. The reports suggest the displacement started before we were monitoring the area. Could be decades of missing persons, all caught in whatever that place is. Then we need to get them out. We need to mount a rescue operation." "With what method? You've seen what that place does to our technology. GPS fails. Communications are unreliable. Thermal imaging shows impossible geometries. How do you propose we navigate a space that doesn't follow normal physical laws?" He'd been right, and I'd known it. But I couldn't accept that we'd just write off everyone trapped in that adjacent space. "There has to be a way," I'd said. "The structured transmissions are clearly attempts at communication. If we can decode them, establish a two-way protocol." "People have tried, Harper. Specialists from agencies you don't have clearance to know about. They've studied the phenomenon, attempted to establish contact, tested various methods to access or stabilize the adjacent space. None of it worked. The space remains inaccessible, and anyone who spends too long trying to understand it risks being pulled in themselves." "Is that what happened to the station chief?" Wyatt had looked surprised. "You know about him?" "I've done my research. He disappeared in '94, 2 months after filing a report about the phenomenon. The official story says he crossed into Mexico. But that's not what happened, is it?" "No," Wyatt had admitted. "He got too close. Started spending his off-duty hours at the station, monitoring the transmissions, trying to decode them. One night, he didn't report for his shift. We found his vehicle at Esperanza, all his equipment still set up, but he was gone. The thermal signatures showed he was still there, moving through that adjacent space, but we couldn't reach him. Someone claiming to be him called me," I'd said, "last week. Told me he chose to disappear, that he's monitoring the situation from outside the system." Wyatt had sat up straighter. That's impossible. If he's in the adjacent space, maybe he found a way out. Or maybe he was never fully in. Maybe he exists in both spaces now, in between. I'd leaned forward. Sir, there's something we're missing. The transmissions say the count is wrong. What if that's not about the number of people? What if it's about the number of spaces? Multiple realities occupying the same coordinates, and we're only seeing one of them? That's theoretical physics far beyond our scope, Harper. Then we bring in people who understand it, physicists, quantum mechanics specialists, whoever can make sense of what's happening there. Wyatt had been quiet for a moment. Then he'd made a decision I could see forming behind his eyes. There's a protocol, he'd said slowly. Not official DEA procedure, more like an interagency agreement. If certain types of phenomena are encountered that exceed normal operational parameters, there's a team that can be contacted. They don't have a public presence. They don't answer to standard government oversight. But they specialize in anomalies. You mean they handle cases like this? They investigate unexplained events that have national security implications. The Esperanza phenomenon qualifies. The potential for hostile forces to exploit or weaponize whatever is happening there, the risk to personnel, the information security concerns, it all adds up to something beyond our ability to manage. He'd pulled out a secure phone, one I'd never seen him use before. A brief conversation, mostly just coordinates and confirmation codes. When he'd hung up, he'd looked at me with an expression that mixed concern and relief. They're sending a team. Should be here within 48 hours. Until then, the Esperanza site is officially off limits to all DEA personnel. That's not a suggestion, Harper. That's a direct order that I will enforce. Understood, sir. And Harper, the recordings you made stay with me. They're now classified under a protocol I can't discuss with you. Officially, you never went to Esperanza. Your weekend trip to Santa Fe is your only activity outside normal duty hours. I'd understood. They were burying my evidence, making sure there was no official trail. But at least they were taking action. The next 48 hours had been tense. I'd continued my normal duties, monitoring communications for routine operations, saying nothing about Esperanza or the recordings. But every night at 2200 hours, I'd tuned to those frequencies on my personal equipment, listening. The structured static was still there, the 12-second pattern, and underneath it, faint but present, the voices of people trapped in that adjacent space. Always the same message. Count wrong. Can't find the way. Help us. On Wednesday evening, an unmarked van had arrived at the Alpine station. 4 people. 2 men, 2 women, dressed in civilian clothes but moving with military precision. They'd met with Wyatt behind closed doors for 2 hours. When they'd emerged, Wyatt had called me in. Agent Harper, this is Dr. Chen and her team. He'd indicated the woman leading the group, a Chinese-American woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an intense focus. They're here to assess the Esperanza situation. Dr. Chen had shaken my hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong. Agent Harper, I understand you've had direct contact with the phenomenon. I need you to brief me on everything you experienced. No detail is too small. I'd walked them through it all. The operation where Team 3 vanished, the historical research, the monitoring of the frequencies, my visit to the station and the recordings I'd made. Dr. Chen had listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a tablet. When I'd finished, she'd pulled up a map on her tablet, showing the Esperanza area. But her map had additional layers, color-coded zones, markers I didn't recognize, data overlays that seemed to show energy readings or signal strength. What you've encountered is what we call a confluence point, she'd explained. A location where the normal parameters of space-time become unstable. Think of it like a radio that's picking up multiple stations at once. They're all broadcasting on frequencies so close together that they bleed into each other. Multiple realities? More like multiple states of the same reality. The space around Esperanza exists in several overlapping configurations simultaneously. Most of the time, these configurations don't interact, but under certain conditions, specific times, atmospheric factors, maybe quantum fluctuations we don't fully understand, the barriers between them become thin, permeable, and people can cross between them. Not intentionally, it's more like falling through. You're in one configuration, the barrier thins, and suddenly you're in another configuration. But because the transition isn't clean, because these spaces are fundamentally incompatible, you can't easily return. How many of these confluence points exist? I'd asked. Dr. Chen had exchanged glances with her team. We've identified 17 along the U.S.-Mexico border. Esperanza is one of the most active. The others are monitored and restricted, but they represent a persistent challenge for border security operations. Does this happen at other borders? Other countries? The phenomenon isn't limited to borders. We've found confluence points in various locations worldwide, but borders seem to amplify them, possibly because they represent an artificial division imposed on continuous space. The contradiction creates stress points in the local space-time structure. The explanation had been both clarifying and terrifying. There were places on Earth where reality didn't work properly, where people could slip between different versions of space, and we'd built our border defenses right through some of them. Can you get Team 3 out? I'd asked. We can try. We've developed some techniques for navigating confluence points, stabilizing the barriers long enough to extract displaced personnel. But it's risky, the success rate isn't high, and every attempt risks destabilizing the confluence further. But you'll try? That's why we're here, Agent Harper. We've reviewed your recordings. The voices you captured represent a significant number of displaced individuals. If we can establish a stable corridor, even temporarily, we might be able to guide them back. Dr. Chen's team had spent the next 2 days at Esperanza, setting up equipment I didn't recognize. Large antenna arrays, quantum field generators, equipment that looked more like particle physics experiments than anything related to border security. I hadn't been allowed on site during the setup, but I'd monitored their communications from the Alpine station. They'd worked through the night, and on Friday at 21:45 hours, Dr. Chen had radioed back. We're ready to attempt extraction, standing by for 2200 hours activation. I'd watched the clock tick toward the activation time, listening to the team's communications. They were coordinating a complex procedure, something about creating a resonance bridge between configurations, using the structured transmissions as a navigation beacon. At 2200 hours, the chatter had increased dramatically. Multiple voices reporting readings, adjusting parameters, fine-tuning the equipment. And underneath it all, I'd heard that familiar structured static beginning to transmit. We're getting resonance, someone had reported. The barrier is thinning, deploying navigation beacon. Multiple signatures appearing, another voice had said. Thermal imaging showing. Dr. Chen, we're reading over 30 displaced individuals. That's far more than we anticipated. Adjust the bridge parameters, Dr. Chen had ordered. We can handle the number. Begin extraction protocol Alpha. For 20 minutes, I'd listened to the teamwork. Their communications a mixture of technical jargon and urgent coordination. They were bringing people out, pulling them from that adjacent space back into ours. Then something had gone wrong. Bridge is destabilizing, someone had shouted. We're losing coherence. Shut it down, Dr. Chen had commanded. Emergency shutdown, now. We still have people on the bridge. If we shut down, shut it down! The confluence is cascading. If we don't stop now, we'll lose the entire team. A burst of static, then silence. Dr. Chen, come in, I transmitted. Report status. It had taken almost a minute before she'd responded, and her voice had been shaken. We've extracted 6 individuals. Team 3, all 4 of them made it back, plus 2 others from earlier displacements. But the bridge collapsed before we could get everyone. How many are still trapped? At least 24 confirmed signatures. We lost count during the destabilization. A pause. Agent Harper, the confluence is now highly unstable. The cascading effect has created new overlaps, more configurations bleeding through. We can't attempt another extraction until it settles, and that could take weeks or months. They'd saved 4 people. 4 out of 30 or more trapped in that space. Better than nothing, but far from enough. The debriefing with Team 3 had taken place at a secure facility in El Paso. I'd been cleared to attend, partly as a witness to the original disappearance, partly because I'd been the one to make contact while they were displaced. Agent Mason had looked thinner, older, traumatized. He'd been in that space for 6 weeks by our timeline, but he'd claimed it felt like months. Time didn't work the same way there. It's like being in a building where the rooms keep changing, he'd described. You walk through a door, and sometimes it leads where you expect. Other times, you're in a completely different space. We tried to navigate by landmarks by GPS, but nothing was consistent. The only constant was that structured transmission. We could hear it, always at what we thought was 2200 hours, and we knew that was our best chance to make contact. Did you see other people there? I'd asked. Shadows of people. We'd see heat signatures, hear voices, but they were always just out of reach. Different frequencies, Chen called them. All trapped in their own versions of that space, all trying to find a way out. The other 2 rescued individuals had similar stories. One claimed he'd been trapped since 2007, 13 years, though he insisted it felt like decades. The other didn't know when he'd been displaced, had lost track of time entirely. All of them reported the same thing. The count was always wrong. You'd see one number of people, thermal would show another number, GPS would indicate yet another number. Because you were existing in multiple overlapping spaces simultaneously, and each space had its own count. Dr. Chen's final report to Wyatt had recommended the confluence point be permanently sealed. Not restricted, not monitored, but actually sealed using a process she'd only vaguely described as quantum anchoring. The confluence is too unstable now, she'd explained. Our extraction attempt accelerated the cascading effect. Within 6 months, the overlapping configurations could extend over a mile radius. Anyone in that area would be at risk of displacement. Can you seal it? Wyatt had asked. We can anchor this configuration, make it the dominant state and suppress the others. But it's not a perfect solution. The people still trapped in the other configurations will effectively be sealed away permanently. We won't be able to reach them. The choice had been stark. Seal the confluence and abandon 24 or more people to permanent displacement, or leave it open and risk the phenomenon spreading to affect a larger area. Wyatt had made the decision. Seal it. We can't risk more people being affected. The sealing operation had taken place 3 weeks later. I hadn't been present, but I'd monitored the frequencies one last time as Dr. Chen's team did their work. At 2200 hours, I'd heard the structured static for the last time. But it wasn't the 12-second pattern anymore. It was something else. Almost like screaming, but at frequencies that made my equipment howl in feedback. Then silence. Complete silence across all frequencies. The confluence point was sealed. The people trapped there were still trapped, but they could no longer communicate with us. Their voices were cut off, locked in spaces we could no longer access. I think about them sometimes. Late at night, when I can't sleep. 24 people, at least, existing in overlapping geometries around a sealed confluence point. Still trying to navigate spaces that don't make sense. Still counting signatures that never add up correctly. Still searching for a way home that no longer exists. And I think about the other confluence points along the border. 17 of them, Dr. Chen had said. All monitored, all restricted, but still active. How many people have been displaced at those sites? How many are still trying to send messages we're not hearing? I transferred out of the Alpine station 6 months ago. Took a position in El Paso, managing communications for a different sector. No confluence points in my area of responsibility. Just normal border operations with conventional problems. But every night at 2200 hours, I stop what I'm doing and listen. Old habit, maybe. Or maybe just the need to know that I'm still in the right frequency, the right configuration, the right version of reality. Because I learned something from the Esperanza confluence that keeps me awake. We assume space is stable, that reality is consistent, that the ground beneath our feet is solid and unchanging. But there are places where that assumption is wrong. Places where you can step from one frequency to another without realizing it. Where the count is always wrong because you're counting across multiple overlapping spaces. And once you know these places exist, once you've heard the voices of people trapped between configurations, you can't ever be completely certain you're still in the right one. Sometimes I get calls on my work phone. Brief, lasting just a second, no caller ID. Just a burst of that structured static, the 12-second pattern, then silence. The system says they're wrong numbers, diagnostic tests, glitches. But I know what they really are. They're proof that the seal isn't perfect. That the voices can still leak through, still trying to tell us that the count is wrong. And every time I hear one, I check my GPS, my thermal imaging, my radio frequencies, making sure all my equipment agrees on where I am. Making sure I haven't slipped across a barrier I didn't know I was crossing. Because the most terrifying thing about confluence points isn't that they exist. It's that you might already be in one and not know it until it's too late to get back. The count is always wrong when you're standing in two places at once. And I can never be certain I'm not. There's a stretch of patrol road in southern New Mexico, about 15 miles east of Columbus, that every agent working the Deming sector learns to avoid. Not officially. There's no memo, no formal restriction. Just an understanding passed from veteran to rookie. If you can find a reason to skip that section of Route 9, you take it. I learned why the hard way. My name is Nolan Briggs, DEA border interdiction since 2011. Transferred to New Mexico's Deming sector 3 months before this happened, October 2019. The sector is vast, empty desert where you can drive for an hour without seeing another vehicle. This was a standard night patrol, 12-hour shift covering the eastern section. My route, a 50-mile loop along the border fence, through checkpoints back to station, should take 4 hours at patrol speed. I'd started at 2,000 hours. First 2 hours were routine. 3 sensor checks, 1 thermal hit that was just javelina, regular dispatch reports every 30 minutes. At 22:15 hours, I turned onto Route 9's eastern section, 15 miles parallel to the border. 10 minutes in, I noticed the discrepancy. Odometer showed 6.3 miles, GPS said 4.1 miles. Unit 7 to dispatch, inconsistent distance readings on Route 9. Dispatcher Ellis responded immediately. What's your current position? Approximately 7.5 miles east, maintaining patrol speed. But my odometer showed 11.2 miles traveled. Describe your surroundings. Standard desert terrain. Fence line south, graded dirt road, no landmarks. Copy. Report any additional anomalies. By 2300 hours, my odometer read over 20 miles. GPS insisted I was only at 10 miles. The 15-mile road should have ended by now. I pulled over at a mile marker. It read, Mile 7. I'd driven over 20 miles and was at mile marker 7. Impossible. Dispatch, mile marker says 7, but I've driven over 20 miles. My tracks are visible behind me. Ellis's voice was controlled. Unit 7, get back in your vehicle and continue east. Report every 5 minutes. I drove. Odometer climbed. 21.5, 22.0, 22.8. GPS barely moved. At 23:15 hours, I passed another mile marker. Mile 7 again. Same distinctive scratch on the metal. I just passed mile marker 7 again. Same marker. Nolan, tell me exactly what you're experiencing. She'd used my first name. This was serious. I've been driving east for over an hour. Odometer says 25 miles, but I keep passing the same landmarks, the same mile marker. GPS insists I'm near the junction, but there's no junction. How are your fuel levels? 3/4 tank. Down from full, so fuel consumption is normal. Nolan, be straight with you. You're not the first to experience this on Route 9. Official policy says GPS dead zone. Between us, nobody who's experienced this can fully explain it. Keep driving. Everyone eventually reaches the junction. How much longer? Varies. Shortest was 2 hours. Longest was more. The odometer passed 30, 35, 40 miles. Each mile marker read 7. Same marker, over and over, though my straight tire tracks proved I wasn't circling. At 23:45 hours, I saw fresh tire tracks ahead. Someone else's vehicle. Dispatch, I'm seeing other vehicle tracks. No other units are on Route 9 tonight. You're alone in that section. I followed them for miles. They looked exactly like my tread pattern. I was following my own tracks from ahead of me, from the future. The tracks I'm following are mine, same tread pattern. This is consistent with previous reports. Spatial distortion. Route 9 doesn't follow normal geometry. You're in a loop, but not circular. More like temporal. The road exists in multiple instances simultaneously. That should have sounded insane, but after 50 miles on the same marker, I accepted it. How do I break out? You don't. Continue until it releases you, usually at dawn. Dawn was 7 hours away. I kept driving, 60 miles, 70, 80. The tire tracks multiplied, now 3 identical sets. At 0100 hours, I saw taillights ahead. Another vehicle, half a mile away, same speed as me. Dispatch visual on another vehicle. Is it maintaining position or pulling away? Maintaining, like we're tethered. I sped up to 75 miles per hour. The distance never changed. I can't close the gap. Slow down, Nolan. You won't catch it. It's you. The vehicle ahead is your own, existing minutes ahead. Behind you is your own taillights following. At 145 hours, the radio crackled with my own voice from 2 hours earlier. Unit 7 to dispatch, inconsistent distance readings. Nolan, this is normal for the loop. You're hearing yourself from a previous iteration. At 0208 hours, I passed my parked vehicle. My patrol SUV, same unit number, engine running, door open, empty. I'm seeing my vehicle parked. Should I stop? Negative. That's another iteration. Keep moving or you'll create a different loop state. At 0300 hours, 142 miles driven. Fuel gauge showed half tank. Consistent with 30 miles, not 142. At 0:30 hours, I saw a figure standing roadside, human-shaped in my headlights. There's someone on the road. Do not stop. It's not someone. It's an echo from another iteration. Keep driving. As I got closer, I saw it wore a DEA uniform, my uniform. It was me. Another version, standing, watching. The head turned as I passed. In my mirrors, it receded into darkness. At 0400 hours, Ellis updated. Sunrise in 2 hours. Loop should release you before then. All previous incidents have resolved by dawn. I drove 180 miles, 200, 220. I'd driven El Paso to Albuquerque on a 15-mile road. At 0545 hours, sky brightening, my GPS suddenly jumped. Mile 10 to mile 15 instantly. The junction. One moment trapped in endless loop. Next, exactly where I should be after 15 miles. My odometer read 247.3 miles. Unit 7, I'm at the junction. I'm out. Ellis's relief was audible. Proceed to Rally Point Bravo for debriefing. You did good, Nolan. I turned north, leaving Route 9 behind. In my mirror, it looked completely normal in dawn light. Just straight graded dirt. But I knew what it really was. Where you could drive for hours passing the same point, where versions of yourself existed simultaneously. And somewhere back there, maybe still trapped in night, other iterations of me. Still driving. Still trying to reach the junction. Were they still there, still trapped? Or had they dissolved when dawn came? Senior Agent Keene was waiting at Rally Point Bravo. 20-year veteran, unflappable. But his look was sympathy mixed with concern. How are you holding up? Confused, scared, but okay. Inside, he poured coffee and sat across from me. Tell me everything. I walked through it. Distance discrepancies, same mile marker, tire tracks from ahead, other vehicles that were mine, standing figures. All of it. Keene took notes. When I finished, 247 miles? Yes, sir. About average for a Route 9 loop. Record is 412 miles, 15 hours before sunrise released him. This has happened multiple times? He pulled out a thick folder. Every few months someone gets caught. We've tried everything. Different schedules, varying routes, even considered closing Route 9. Phenomenon persists. He spread maps across the desk. Route 9 marked in red, covered with notations and timestamps. First documented in 1987, though anecdotal reports go back further. Border Patrol Agent Crawford experienced the same discrepancies. They thought equipment malfunction until they checked his fuel consumption. He'd driven 180 miles on a 15-mile road. What's causing it? We don't know. Sector brought in geologists, physicists, even Los Alamos. Every analysis comes back normal. But it's not normal. Whatever's happening on Route 9 doesn't show up on instruments from outside. You have to be inside to experience it. He showed me a redacted report. 1993 experiment. 2 vehicles drove Route 9 simultaneously, maintaining radio contact. One experienced the loop. The other, 10 minutes behind, drove normally and reached the junction without incident. How? Loop appears selective. Maybe 1 in 50 transits results in loop experience. No pattern. Time of day, weather, vehicle type, driver demographics. None correlate. Random? Maybe. Or selection criteria we don't understand. He leaned forward. Here's what concerns me. Incidents are increasing. 1990s, 1 or 2 per year. 2000s, 4 or 5. Past 5 years, averaging 1 per month. He He showed incident reports, distance discrepancies, multiple iterations, figures standing roadside. One 2015 report caught my attention. Agent Dalton saw not just one standing figure, but dozens, all along the roadside wearing DEA uniforms, just watching. What happened to Dalton? Retired early, psychological trauma. Keene retrieved the report. He claimed they weren't just echoes, said they were aware that they turned to watch, that one tried to flag him down. I saw that too. One was waving. Did you stop? No. Dispatch said not to. Good. Only 3 agents have stopped and interacted. All 3 reported temporal dissonance, memory confusion. One claimed she experienced both versions, staying in vehicle and getting out simultaneously. Couldn't distinguish which was real. Keene closed the folder. Official policy. Route 9 experiences result from magnetic anomalies. Reports are classified. We're containing it. If word got out, we have a road where space-time doesn't work, media circus, congressional inquiries demands to shut down the entire sector. Maybe we should. Is it dangerous? In 30 years, no agent physically harmed. Psychologically disturbed, yes. But we need to patrol that section. Shutting down Route 9 creates a gap cartels would exploit within days. After writing my report, I returned to Route 9 in daylight. It looked normal, straight dirt road, fence to the south. I walked to mile 7, just a standard marker. But standing there, I felt wrongness. Not physical, but psychological. I pulled out my GPS. It flickered, showing my position jumping within a 100-foot radius. Then I heard an engine. Vehicle approaching from the east. No vehicle was visible. The engine grew louder, clearly getting closer. My GPS showed a DEA patrol unit approaching, passing right through my location. I felt cold wind. The engine noise was deafening for a moment, as if a vehicle passed within feet. Then it faded westward, GPS marker showing it moving away. An iteration still running. Invisible in daylight, but still there. Someone still trapped, still passing mile 7 over and over. Was it me from last night? Or someone from weeks ago, months ago, years ago? 6 months later, I noticed something in the incident reports nobody had caught. A pattern suggesting they weren't random. Using the full archive, 30 years of documented incidents, I created a timeline. At first glance, distribution looked random. But when I plotted incidents against celestial positions, specifically Mars and Jupiter, a pattern emerged. Every single loop incident occurred when Mars was at a specific declination angle, between 17 and 19 degrees above the southern horizon. 100% correlation. My experience. October 2019, 22:15 hours. Mars at 18.3 degrees. I took findings to Keene. He studied my data in silence. You're not the first to notice. Someone else found the Mars correlation. 1995, Agent Pacheco. Worked 12 years. Did similar analysis, found same pattern. Proposed scheduling patrols to avoid Mars trigger angle. What happened? Rejected, said it was pseudoscience. But Pacheco started avoiding Route 9 during Mars windows anyway. Worked fine for 2 years. Then one night, Mars and trigger zone she was asked to cover for sick agent. She refused, citing research. Command gave her a choice. Work assigned patrol or early retirement. She chose retirement. She chose to stay alive. Pacheco had a theory about why Mars mattered. Something about gravitational effects combining with Earth's magnetic field to create space-time distortions. She was convinced entering the loop during peak Mars influence would be more dangerous. Dangerous how? She claimed loop was strengthening. Predicted eventually it would trap someone permanently. They'd enter and never emerge. Did it come true? Not yet. But in 2003, Agent Garrett entered loop during Mars peak, drove 18 hours, well past sunrise. When he emerged, disoriented, claimed he'd experienced hundreds of iterations, saw thousands of versions of himself roadside. What happened? Medical retirement, psychological trauma. But before leaving, he told me loop was learning. Each person who went through added to its complexity, made it stronger. Said eventually it would trap someone permanently. Keene handed me a file. I'm giving you Pacheco's research, all of it. Study it, verify it, extend it, but quietly. Command doesn't want this circulating. I spent the next month going through Pacheco's work. Thorough, astronomical calculations, patrol schedules, incident reports, all cross-referenced. Her conclusion, Route 9 phenomenon linked to specific celestial mechanics, could be predicted with accuracy. But she'd also documented something else. The loop was intensifying. 1980s incidents, 2 to 4 hours. 1990s, 4 to 6 hours. 2000s, 6 to 10 hours. Recent incidents, 10 to 12 hours average. Not only more frequent, but lasting longer. The phenomenon was growing stronger. Pacheco's projection, by 2025, average loop duration would exceed 24 hours. By 2030, the loop would become permanent. Anyone entering would never emerge, driving eternally, cycling through infinite iterations until they died of thirst, exhaustion, or madness. I shared this with Keene. Pacheco's timeline might be optimistic. Intensification is accelerating. We might hit permanent loop conditions before 2030. If that happens, we close Route 9 completely. What if we could solve it? Not just predict or avoid it, but fix whatever's causing it. How would you fix a spatial anomaly? If it's connected to Mars positioning, maybe we can disrupt that connection. Identify what physical mechanism creates the loop, then counter it. Keene authorized controlled experiments. Over 3 months working with agents Martinez and Foster, we ran tests. First experiment: drive Route 9 during Mars peak while transmitting GPS to external monitoring. Martinez volunteered as test driver. At 2145 hours, he entered Route 9. First 15 minutes normal. Then at 2200, GPS fluctuated. Command: I'm getting weird readings. GPS shows mile 8, but odometer says mile 10. For the next hour, we tracked his signal as it became erratic, sometimes progressing normally, sometimes jumping backward, occasionally showing him in multiple locations simultaneously. But the pattern wasn't random. GPS jumps followed a specific sequence, repeating every 12 minutes. The loop had a rhythm, measurable and consistent. When Martinez emerged at sunrise, 198 miles driven, our GPS tracking showed something remarkable. His actual position had traced a complex pattern, not a circle or figure 8, but a 3-dimensional spiral intersecting itself multiple times. He'd been moving through nested layers of space, each iteration offset slightly. It's not a simple loop, I concluded. It's a manifold. Multiple layers of space occupying the same coordinates, but offset in another dimension. Based on GPS data, at least 7 distinct spatial layers. And the standing figures? Iterations trapped in different layers. When layers align closely enough, you can see through to other versions. Second experiment: introduce electromagnetic interference at specific frequencies. Foster was test driver, with Martinez and me operating interference equipment. The electromagnetic interference had no effect on the loop. Foster entered and experienced standard loop event. But something unexpected happened. Foster reported hearing us talking on the radio. but discussing things that hadn't happened yet, asking questions he hadn't answered yet. Temporal displacement, I realized. Loop isn't just repeating space, it's shifting time. You were hearing our conversation from later in your iteration. Third experiment was dangerous. I volunteered to enter the loop carrying instruments to measure local space-time curvature. Equipment from a university physics department. Plan, gather real-time data from inside the phenomenon. But when I entered Route 9 at predicted Mars peak, the loop didn't form. I drove the entire 15 miles normally. Nothing's happening. Approaching junction normally. Confirmed, your GPS shows normal progression. I reached the junction without incident. The loop simply hadn't manifested. At first, we thought it was the equipment interfering. But reviewing data, we found something else. The instruments had recorded a massive space-time distortion, far stronger than expected. The loop had been there. It had formed normally, but I hadn't entered it. I'd driven through normal space coexisting with the loop, never transitioning. It's selective, I concluded. Loop doesn't catch everyone during peak periods. It chooses. Next month, during the following Mars peak, the loop caught me immediately. And this time, I saw something new. The standing figures weren't just watching. They were arranged in patterns, organized into formations that looked deliberate. Mile 7, 7 figures in a circle, facing inward. Mile 9, 9 figures in a straight line. Mile 11, 11 figures in 2 rows. Numbers matched the mile markers. The phenomenon was communicating through iteration arrangement. I stopped at mile 7, against protocol, but I needed to examine the formation. 7 figures, all me, in perfect circle about 20 feet diameter. As I approached, they all turned to face me simultaneously. Not threatening, just watching. I stepped into the center. Temperature dropped immediately, that same cold, but this time, another sound. Vibration at edge of hearing. A frequency, specific tone that seemed to resonate. It was counting. Not in numbers, but in pulses. 7 pulses, silence, 7 pulses again. Mile 7. The phenomenon was marking the location, emphasizing it. I set up the space-time curvature instruments at that exact spot. Data they captured was remarkable. Mile 7 was the center point. The spot where the spatial manifold concentrated, where layers intersected most closely. It was the anchor of the loop, the point around which everything cycled. And the instruments detected something else. Regular pulse of energy emanating from that spot, synchronized with Mars' position. Every time Mars crossed a specific angle, pulse strengthened. Manifold became more active. We'd found the mechanism. Route 9 wasn't generating the loop. It was receiving it, a transmission of spatial distortion tied to Mars' position concentrated at mile 7 and radiating outward. But that raised a disturbing question. If Route 9 was receiving this transmission, what was sending it? I shared the theory with Keen. Something on Mars was generating this. He pulled out another classified file. There's a group, he said carefully. Not DEA, not officially government. They investigate phenomena like Route 9, looking for patterns connecting different anomalies. They've been monitoring this for years. What have they found? Route 9 isn't unique. 17 similar spatial anomalies along the border, but also hundreds worldwide, all concentrated along specific latitude lines. He showed me a map. Dots marking anomaly locations formed distinct patterns, aligned along latitudes corresponding to specific angles relative to Mars' orbit. Every anomaly activates when Mars is in particular position. Exact angle varies by latitude, but correlation is consistent. So Mars is the source, or Mars is a relay. something in its orbit or on its surface broadcasting these spatial distortions to Earth. He pulled out telescope observations of Mars dating back decades. In 1907, when first Route 9 loop was documented, NASA's Viking orbiters detected unusual electromagnetic signature in Mars's atmosphere. Brief, lasting only hours, but powerful enough to interfere with instruments. Coincidence? That's what NASA thought. But similar signatures detected every few years since, always during same Mars-Earth alignment correlating with Route 9 events. What kind of signature? Structured, pulsed, not consistent with any known natural phenomenon. NASA's official position, atmospheric interference from dust storms. But unofficial analysis suggests source is something artificial. You're saying there's something on Mars generating these signals? Something intelligent? We don't know what's on Mars, but whatever's creating Route 9 phenomenon, it's linked to that planet in ways we can't explain through natural processes. Keene closed the files. The group wants to meet with you. They want to help investigate what Route 9 really is. 2 weeks later, I met with them at a secure facility in Las Cruces. 3 people, Dr. Reeves, senior scientist, another scientist, and a military officer. Dr. Reeves got straight to the point. Your work on Route 9 has been impressive. You've gathered more useful data in 6 months than we've collected in years. Can you explain what's actually happening? We can share what we know. Route 9 is what we call a reception point, a location where space-time has been modified to receive and manifest transmissions from elsewhere. From Mars, almost certainly. The military officer spoke. We've identified 43 reception points globally. All activate in correlation with specific celestial positions, primarily Mars and Jupiter. Effects vary. Some create spatial loops like Route 9. Others cause temporal distortion. Still others produce localized gravity anomalies. What's the purpose? Unknown, the second scientist said. But there's a pattern to placement, concentrated along former territorial boundaries, ancient borders, discontinued frontier lines, divisions that existed historically but not currently. Dr. Reeves pulled up archaeological data. 3 miles north of Route 9, there's evidence of a prehistoric settlement, dated to approximately 900 CE. Unusual stone arrangements that don't match known architectural styles. Several arrangements align with exact position where Mars would have appeared during reception active periods. Possible evidence ancient people were tracking the phenomenon. So this has been happening for over 1,000 years, possibly much longer. Archaeological evidence is limited, but indications suggest spatial anomalies along border regions have persisted for millennia. The military officer leaned forward. We're planning a deep investigation of Mile 7, the anchor point you identified. We want to excavate, see if there's anything physical creating or focusing the reception field. We need someone with ground experience to help coordinate. What are you hoping to find? Evidence of the transmission mechanism. If there's something at Mile 7 receiving or amplifying the signal from Mars, we need to understand what it is, and if possible, how to shut it down. I agreed to help. Over 2 months, we planned the operation. Ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies beneath Mile 7, structures or objects that shouldn't be there, at depths suggesting they predated modern human activity. Excavation began in July, during period when Mars was not in trigger angle. At 4 feet, a stone marker carved with symbols referencing celestial positions. At 8 feet, something that made everyone stop. It was a device, no other word fit. Metallic, but not any metal from nature. Composed of elements Earth geology didn't explain, combinations suggesting either exotic formation or artificial manufacture. And it was active, despite being buried for unknown centuries, still functioning. emitting low-frequency electromagnetic pulses matching the pattern we detected during loop events. "This is the receiver," Dr. Reeves said. "This is what's catching the transmission from Mars and converting it into the spatial manifold." "How old?" "We don't know. Carbon dating isn't working, no organic material. Based on depth and surrounding soil, it's been here at least 2,000 years, possibly much longer. Who made it? That's the question that scares me. Humans didn't have capability to manufacture this 2,000 years ago. We don't have the capability now. The materials, precision, energy source, none match human technology." The military officer made the obvious conclusion. "It's not from Earth, or from Earth's future," the second scientist suggested. "Time travel, sending technology back to establish reception points. Either way," Dr. Reeves said, "we're dealing with something exceeding our understanding, and it's been here, operating, for a very long time." We excavated carefully, finding more layers beneath. A network of similar objects, all connected, all pulsing with the same frequency. Together, they formed something like an antenna array, focused on receiving signals from specific direction of Mars when in trigger angle. The team wanted to shut it down, but I argued, we don't know what happens if we stop it. Loop might intensify or collapse, creating different anomaly. Study it first. They agreed reluctantly. Device left in place, surrounded by monitoring equipment. That night, I stayed monitoring equipment. At exactly 2200 hours, even though Mars wasn't in trigger angle, the device activated. Not normal pulse, surge of energy. And something else happened. Air above mile 7 shimmered, and through that shimmer I saw elsewhere. Not another location on Earth, not another time. A different place entirely. Red sand, thin atmosphere, wrong-colored sky. I was looking at Mars, through some portal or viewing window, seeing Mars surface in real time. And there, in center of view, was a structure. Not natural. Definitely not natural. Geometric, precise, too regular. A transmission station on Mars. Broadcasting signals that created reception points like Route 9 across Earth. Vision lasted maybe 10 seconds before shimmer collapsed. But those 10 seconds changed everything. I documented what I'd seen, reported to team. Dr. Reeves was excited and terrified. "If you saw Mars, if device can create viewing portals, this technology is far more advanced than we thought." And the implications, what implications? If this system has been operating for thousands of years, broadcasting from Mars to Earth, what's it been broadcasting? Just spatial distortions, or information, or something else? Over next weeks, as team studied device more thoroughly, patterns emerged. Device was programmed to activate during specific astronomical configurations. Not just Mars's position, but Jupiter, Saturn, even distant Neptune. Each configuration triggered different response, different type of reception. Route 9 loop was just one manifestation. Others waiting for right planetary alignment. And according to calculations, a rare alignment was approaching. In 6 months, all 4 outer planets would be in positions device seemed specifically designed to respond to. What happens then? We don't know, Dr. Reeves admitted, but based on energy readings, it's going to be significant. Much more powerful than Route 9 loop. Should we shut it down? Maybe. But if we do, we might never understand what this system is really for. This could be our only chance to see it operate at full capacity. Decision was made above our level. Device would remain active, monitored constantly, with contingency plans to shut down if dangerous. The alignment is scheduled for January, 3 months from now, and I've been assigned to lead monitoring team at Mile 7 to observe whatever happens when all planets fall into position. I think about Route 9 differently now. It's not just an anomaly, it's part of a system, a network connecting Earth and Mars, possibly other worlds, for purposes we haven't begun to understand. And I think about the iterations I saw. Were they really echoes? Or were they messages? Warnings from iterations that had seen what comes next, trying to communicate across manifold layers. The count is wrong. Maybe because we're counting wrong. Maybe because there are more versions of us existing simultaneously than we realize. In 3 months, I'll stand at Mile 7 and watch as device activates at full power. I'll see what happens when Earth and Mars align in ways they haven't aligned in millennia. Part of me is terrified. Part of me needs to know. Because, after everything, driving 247 miles on 15-mile road, seeing iterations arranged in patterns, watching portal open to Mars, I can't walk away from the answer. Even if the answer changes everything we think we know about reality, about who built these systems, about whether we're really alone. 3 months until the alignment. 3 months until I find out if Route 9 is warning or invitation. 3 months until Loop either releases us or traps us permanently. And somewhere on Mars, a transmission station is broadcasting, has been for thousands of years, waiting for the day when we're ready to understand. I just hope we're ready for the answer, because I have a feeling the loop was never the problem. It was the test, and we're about to find out if we passed.